Chapter 520. Night came early on the icy plains, and the sun naturally came late. Su-lu gobbled down the warm, nutritious meal in large mouthfuls. Beneath his slightly narrowed eyes was a shadow drawn by fatigue. That night, he and Shang-Chiu had not slept a wink, anxiously carrying out repair work. Those sporadic gunshots in the dark of the night disturbed him like an irregular drum beat, and so on and so forth. Tired from the mecha battle, his spirit seemed to be even weaker. After hastily filling his stomach, Su-lu casually grabbed a handful of cold snow beside him and wiped his face. He felt that his spirit seemed to have improved a little. Su-lu did not immediately continue his repair work. Instead, he closed his eyes and silently circulated the power in his body, allowing the aching muscle fibers to stretch and expand in order to recover his spirit as soon as possible. Shang-Chiu could not hold on any longer. He lay down on the chair to rest, but he did not want to give himself too much time to rest. This ambushed Green Dragon Mountain vanguard could still rely on the electronic binoculars to command the lower-level troops on the snowy plains. However, there was still no news from the 2 battalions on the snowy peaks. If the command system had been repaired a minute earlier, the Green Dragon Mountain troops would have been able to make overall plans, and perhaps a few of the Federation youths would have been able to survive. He heard the steady sound of footsteps behind him. After opening his eyes, he did not turn around. Lowering his head slightly, he said apologetically, "It's not fixed yet, but it can definitely be fixed. Unfortunately, I can't give you time." "That's not what I want to ask," replied Green Dragon Mountain Vanguard Commander Li Ming with a smile. He plopped his butt down onto the snow pile beside Su-lu, panting heavily. Rubbing his wilted hair, he continued, "Actually, before you all arrived, I was already in despair. Of course, as the highest-ranking officer of the troops, I cannot show this kind of despair. Your arrival has given us hope. That is enough. But we must hurry." Su-lu glanced at the dark sun on the snowy plains and said worriedly, "The Empire's people may still be sleeping at this time, but they will definitely launch the fiercest attack during the day." Li Ming understood what he meant. When the Imperial Expeditionary Force saw the 2 Federation mecha barge into the battlefield yesterday, they would naturally think that the Federation's reinforcements would arrive soon after. They would definitely make the best use of the remaining time and do everything possible to finish off this Green Dragon Mountain squad. That's an entire Empire's army. I'm guessing that the most powerful forces of that old General Ambry's army are gathered around this snowfield. Li Ming's gaze pierced through the wind and snow on the battlefield and looked directly at the Empire's position in the distance. He said faintly, "The battle has been going on for 2 days and 2 nights. The fact that we are still alive is actually all thanks to the electromagnetic beam bombs. Their mecha horde didn't dare to charge together. I think it's probably because the enemy's commanding officer didn't want to sacrifice the last of his forces, so he would rather exchange his men's lives for ours. However, we've already used up the last of our ammunition yesterday. Although we've destroyed quite a few of their mechas, we can't solve this most critical problem. Last night, there were only small attacks. I think the Empire is also evaluating our ammunition reserves." Su-lu looked down at the snow beside his military boots and said softly, "Actually, in my heart, I've always, cough, had a question." Commander Li Ming coughed twice. His brows furrowed in pain. He covered his mouth and said, "An entire Imperial brigade with 3 times the military strength of us. They have dozens or even hundreds of wolf mechas. Looking at their crazy suicidal drive, they shouldn't be cherishing their feathers. I keep feeling like they're waiting for something. Besieging the base to attack the reinforcements." Su-lu shook his head and said, "The Empire's people are already on the verge of death. Their equipment and firepower are several levels lower than ours. It wasn't easy for them to gather such an entire brigade. They also had to borrow the help of the heavens and extremely good luck to be able to surround you guys. If their appetite is so big that they want to ambush the Federation's reinforcements, then they are really stupid to the extreme. Even if any one of the 3 regiments of our division were to come, the Empire's people definitely wouldn't be able to hold them off. Then how do you explain why the Empire's people on the other side are fighting so badly but still aren't willing to send in all their combat forces? Like idiots, they're using this kind of tactic to add fuel to the fire. Li Ming stared into his eyes and said faintly, because you don't understand the current feelings of the Empire's military officers. They're surrounding us not because they want to attack reinforcements but because they want to fight with their lives on the line. Fight with their lives on the line. Su Lu frowned. After the war at the dividing line between the North and the South, the Empire's main forces collapsed. The Federal Army attacked fiercely to the north. Then, in the past few months, they suddenly slowed down. Our troops are like peeling apples, relying on their overwhelming advantage in equipment, slowly and calmly nibbling away at their living forces. We've also firmly trapped them in the glacier region. The Empire's people have long since known what their final outcome will be. This is a fact that can't be changed at all. Unless the millions of Empire's native troops suddenly come through the spatial tunnel on warships. Li Ming laughed mockingly and said, "Of course, this is impossible. That's why they want to fight with their lives on the line. They want to make one last crazy gamble." However, the Federal Army has never been willing to give them a chance to fight with their lives on the line. The great difference in strength between the 2 sides makes it impossible for these remnants of the Empire to seek a quick death. The geomagnetic storm and snowstorm coming together is extremely rare. This is why they've been given the opportunity to seek a quick death. So, not only do they want to eat my regiment, they also want to drag in a Federation regiment. Even if they lose in the end, they don't care. They only want a few more of our soldiers to die. Su Lu looked at the other side of the snowstorm and silently listened to Commander Li Ming's analysis. He really wanted to mock the Empire's people on the other side for being so anxious to die, but a faint chill unexpectedly rose in his heart. The Imperial armies were so cruel and crazy to themselves. If the Federation attacked the Empire's native lands in the future, just how terrifying of an attack would they encounter? As if seeing his current mood, Commander Li Ming disdainfully said, "Don't think that the Empire's bastards are too scary. If they were facing the same situation as us, I reckon we'd make the same choice." Su Lu thought for a moment and nodded in agreement with this inference. Being in a foreign country where death was certain, with countless enemies with absolute superiority in equipment in front of him, and only the vast space and the long and unpredictable journey back home without a warship, this was a feeling of despair. If it were him, he would probably have the same reaction. In space 742,331 meters above the ground, a fleet of 11 Lightfeather-class warships floated in the spacious space without gravity. In the large-scale universe background, the fleet that should have been majestic appeared somewhat lonely and desolate. In the strategic planning of the Federation, the current priority of the Federal Fleet was to prevent the Empire's fleet from coming out from the barren star region to provide support to the 3 fallen star systems. Although these Empire's fleet that came from afar had outdated technology and had gone through 6 to 7 years of dangerous interstellar travel, they were no match for the Federal Fleet. However, in order to perfectly end the military operation, the Federation still paid enough attention to them. Even the Second Fleet that was originally stationed in the Gary Corridor was moved to the edge of the Westwood Star region. Therefore, most of the warships that had ambushed the Empire's fleet in the 3 fallen star systems were also moved away. In the Gray and Silver Federation Command ship, the Deputy Commander of the Federation's 1st Military Region, Lieutenant General Yi Changtian, who had just arrived from the 163 star system to command the final battle of 5,460, coldly looked at the brightly colored planet below the porthole. After a moment of silence, he turned around and said, "All troops participating in the battle above latitude 40, stop the rotation and gather immediately. Move closer to the geomagnetic storm area." This was a spacious battle command hall. After the dozens of Federation staff officers heard the order, they were slightly stunned, but they immediately responded in a deep voice. "That old bastard Umburi wants to risk his life. I don't want to give him the chance to risk his life." Commander Yi lowered his eyes slightly and continued, "Tell Du Shaoqing and Yu Qinghai that their two divisions are the closest to the storm area. Don't be too slow and don't be too gentle. Smash your fists together. Don't even scratch off a piece of skin. Understood." The staff officer beside him quickly made a record. Looking at the data on the mini-work light screen, he hesitantly reminded, "According to the calculation of the charter computer, the geomagnetic storm will last for about 10 to 15 days. What does the geomagnetic storm have to do with war?" Commander Yi raised his eyebrows and looked at the young officers in the command hall. "Back then, we encountered a volcanic eruption on the Empire's K2 planet. The ionosphere changed, but we still had to fight. Could it be that the current troops have become useless dolls without the charter computer as a nanny? If that's the case, what will happen if we attack the Empire in the future?" This respected general showed a displeased expression and asked, "Or do you think that the Empire's people will be tolerant enough to let us build the charter computer network in their home planet bit by bit?" The officers lowered their heads and quickly walked to their own workstations. Through the charter computer, they began to make tactical deductions. At the same time, they sent the commander's order to all the troops of the Federation on the planet's surface. "We just received a report from the 17th Division. Their 1st Regiment set off 2 days ago and entered the geomagnetic storm area 2 hours ago. We lost contact with them. The situation is unknown." An officer walked over with an anxious expression and reported in a low voice. "Very good. Yu Qinghai's troops indeed have some of the old 17th Division. If they still wait for orders from the headquarters at this time, then they are really stupid to the extreme. But this time, the performance of the Iron 7th Division has disappointed me." Commander Yi turned around with his hands behind his back and looked coldly at the planet under his feet. He stared at the dazzling white at the northern end of the planet and said nothing. It was as if he was not worried at all about the trapped Green Dragon Mountain troops and the 17th Division's 1st Regiment that had disappeared without a trace. As for Su Lu, who was the first to go to support them, it did not make his expression change in the slightest. The old general of the Empire on the ground tried to use the power of nature to seek a heroic ending. However, for this old general of the Federation, wasn't this also an excellent opportunity to enter the Empire's mainland for a training exercise? The command hall was silent. Only the faint sound of electric current and the sound of fingers rubbing against the hologram rang out. No one noticed that in the corner of the giant hologram, the Federal Central Computer had been rapidly calculating the changes in the planet's climate. It was not only calculating how long the geomagnetic storm and snowstorm would last, but it seemed to be analyzing why such a problem would occur on this planet. Chapter 521. The biting cold wind blew in through the gap in the fiberglass door. It circled around the liquid hydrogen stove a few times in vain before lazily warming up and dispersing into the warm air. Zhou Yu lowered his head and sat on the chair. He stared at his slightly peeling fingers in silence. His expression was gloomy and stiff. He was disturbed by the annoying cold and warm air. He subconsciously raised his head and looked out through the gap in the door. He realized that the snowstorm that had started to ease 4 days ago had completely disappeared in today's warm weather. He was a top student at the 1st Military Academy. During the graduation drill, he successfully played the role of the brain of the military students. It was also because of his outstanding performance that he became a rare talent that Du Shaoqing cherished. At the beginning of the year, he was forcibly transferred to the Iron 7th Division. To be able to receive the appreciation and love of the Federation's famous General Du Shaoqing and to be able to enter the most prestigious Iron 7th Division in the Federation, Zhou Yu saw a bright future ahead of him. However, he was not as happy as others thought. He was from the West Woods. He was a student sponsored by the Xiu Shu Foundation. He had a close relationship with Su Lu. In the eyes of the West Woods people, Commander Zhong, who was like an emperor, had a deep grudge with Commander Shaoqing. Even Mo Cho did not want to see him forcibly taken away by some faction in the military. More importantly, Su Lu, and the new 17th Division he was currently in, due to certain historical and current reasons, had always been at odds with Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division. His classmates and officers at the training base, the men he was familiar with in Iron 7th Division, and most of the people Zhou Yu was familiar with had all entered the new 17th Division. However, he was the only one who had entered the Iron 7th Division. Although it could not be said that he was at a loss for no reason, he was still unhappy and could not be at ease. This mood fermented because of the recent incident. It made him, who was usually as gentle as jade, feel a trace of uncontrollable depression and anger. He was silent for a very long time. When he saw the white blisters between his fingers and the white snow outside the door, his eyes hurt. The annoyance on his face gradually disappeared. He stood up abruptly and walked through the short snow tunnel. He quickly walked into the room where the regiment headquarters was. Dong Fangpei, the leader of the 1st Regiment of the Iron 7th Division, was sitting on a leather chair with a cup of coffee in his hand. He was resting with his eyes closed. He looked very relaxed. When he was in S1, Commander Du Shaoqing was used to wearing a pair of sheepskin black gloves. As the saying goes, subordinates follow the example of their superiors. The senior officers under him had also been infected with this style, not to mention that this was 5,460. The forest at the edge of the glacier was full of wild beasts without the protection of electronic walls. When Zhou Yu saw this scene, he thought to himself, even if this superior of mine were to wear 100 pairs of sunglasses, he would only ever be able to learn a little from teacher Shaoqing. After a short pause, he asked in a deep voice, "I really want to know what you are thinking. Do you know that on the snowy plains less than 400 kilometers away from you, there are thousands of Federation soldiers being ambushed by the Empire?" Dong Fangpei opened his eyes, looked at him and said indifferently, "The ones being ambushed are the bastards from Green Dragon Mountain. I don't think of them as comrades. Commander Dongfang, I want to ask you to pay attention that they are now designated as the 1st Special Army of the Federation. If you don't want this kind of statement to be known by the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense, I advise you to correct your relationship with them and not posture with your coffee," Zhou Yu said bluntly. "I also want to ask you to correct your relationship with them." Dong Fangpei's expression changed slightly. He stood up and pointed at Zhou Yu's nose and said, "I am your commander. What kind of attitude is this? If you don't want to force me to punish you with military law, I advise you to take back what you just said." The officers of the Iron 7th Division all knew that their commander appreciated Zhou Yu very much. For some reason, Dong Fangpei was very dissatisfied with the fact that the division sent Zhou Yu to the 1st Regiment to train. Now that he heard Zhou Yu criticize him, his anger surged. "I apologize, Commander Dongfang," Zhou Yu said calmly. He stared at Dong Fangpei with an unyielding persistence in his calm gaze. "But I don't think it's the style of the Iron 7th Division to leave people in the lurch. The army is first and foremost a disciplined army. Without receiving orders, I am responsible for the 1st Regiment." Dong Fangpei stared at him and reprimanded him without any trace of politeness. "What exactly are you thinking in that head of yours? Discipline is not mechanical, and it is not cold-blooded. When you need to shorten the reaction time the most, the frontline commander is stubbornly waiting for remote orders from a few people outside of the sequence. I never knew that war was fought like this. I am very suspicious of your true purpose for doing this." Dong Fangpei's eyes gradually became vicious. He walked in front of Zhou Yu and said coldly, "Then what do you think my true purpose is?" "I suspect that you are deliberately carrying out an inhumane murder," Zhou Yu said calmly. "4 days ago, Lieutenant Colonel Su Le sent out a request for reinforcements. You ignored it and forcibly delayed the transmission of the situation. Why is that? Do you want to use the hands of the Empire to kill the people of Green Dragon Mountain, or do you want Lieutenant Colonel Su Le to die there as well? I'm warning you, you are making a very serious criminal charge against a lieutenant colonel." Dong Fangpei was silent for a moment. Then he said with a cold expression, "Yes, I do look down on this Lieutenant Colonel Su Le who used to be a mercenary. Because as a member of the disciplined army, I hate this kind of bullshit performance of fearless and brainless heroism. But murder him? Do I need to do this? You should be asking why you are doing this. Zhou Yu raised his head and looked directly into his eyes. He said, in my opinion, it is because the three Chang brothers were originally officers of the 1st Regiment. Also, because of the graduation Japanese war show, the conflict between Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu and the division commander. How could you not want him to die? Don't forget that you are now an officer of the Iron 7th Division. You should know where you should sit. Dong Fangpei's eyes became colder and colder. He said slowly, and you underestimate me too much. We, the Iron 7th Division, have never had the habit of shooting our comrades in the back on the battlefield. I just want to ask, are you going to save him or not? Zhou Yu felt a sense of danger from the other party. Dong Fangpei was the highest officer in the army. Although he was an officer personally sent by Du Shaoqing, if the other party really wanted to use military law to punish him, there was nothing he could do. However, when he thought of the battlefield hundreds of kilometers away without any news, he had to ask this question clearly. I am not a reckless man. Dong Fangpei's eyelids drooped slightly. He said, someone, put him in solitary confinement for 10 days. At this moment, the signaller quickly walked over and said in a nervous tone, the division commander is calling. At the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division, Shiman Jin stood quietly in the corner with a towel. He watched the division commander hang up the phone with a gloomy face. He thought of the military order he had just received from the headquarters of the Federation. His heart couldn't help but sink. He walked forward and handed the hot towel to Du Shaoqing. Du Shaoqing picked up the hot towel and rubbed his numb face. After recovering some of his energy, he sat back in the chair again. He stared at the data electronic map on the hologram in front of him and continued the tactical deduction that had been interrupted earlier. 10 years ago, he asked to be transferred to the 7th Armored Division of the 2nd Military Region of the Federation. Since then, this division had won countless military exercises and won the respect and admiration of countless people. However, this division had never had the chance to show its real victory on the battlefield in exchange for real meritorious service. He was also forcefully suppressed by a big shot who had crossed both the military and the government for 10 years. 10 years later, he finally came to the real front line. He and his division indeed didn't disappoint the entire Federation. From the first successful military action in the Yellow Mountain Ridge, they turned into a fierce northern expedition and defeated the main forces of the Empire. Until now, they had chased the remnants of the Empire into the ice and snow region, where they couldn't find the slightest opportunity to escape. After countless beautiful and tragic battles, the Iron 7th Division had perfectly achieved its strategic mission without any flaws. Many people had the same evaluation of Du Shaoqing. His thinking was as meticulous as a monster, and as cold and serious as a cedar. From President Pabre to the federal military to tens of billions of ordinary citizens, they all regarded him as the most famous commander of the Federation's Mesozoic generation. They all thought that he was very likely to be the successor of the military god. However, no success in the universe was accidental. Outsiders only saw the cold and confident appearance of this commander Du Shaoqing, and his exquisite command that seemed to come by chance. Only the most loyal subordinate officers around him knew that their commander would spend a lot of time on tactical deduction and pre-battle preparation in the face of a battle, no matter how big or small it was. It was definitely not an exaggeration to say that their commander exhausted himself. Helay's 1st Regiment set off to the northeast 3 days ago. The 2nd Regiment and the 3rd Regiment also passed through Dong Fangpei's position last night. They are already ahead of us. Shiman Jin first reported the current situation, and then explained tentatively. Dong Fangpei was the first to find out about this news, and had already informed the division headquarters, but at that time, you were sleeping. Du Shaoqing lowered his head and looked at the electronic map. The pen in his hand occasionally wrote some symbols on the map that only he could understand. After hearing Shiman Jin's words, he raised his right hand and waved it. Shimin Jin sighed in his heart. He knew that his commander was already extremely angry with Dong Fangpei at this time, but he and Dong Fangpei had been his commander's personal soldiers since 10 years ago, and their relationship was very close. At this time, he had to explain a little and hope that it could ease his commander's anger. After a few minutes, Du Shaoqing finally finished the work at hand. He rubbed his eyebrows tiredly, but still maintained a sitting posture and refused to lean back on the chair. Discipline is the most important thing in the army. Even if the 17th Division beat us to it this time, I will not be angry because of this. Du Shaoqing said with a gloomy expression, but he actually had the guts to suppress the news that Su Lu had asked for help. This is unforgivable. Shimin Jin said with some difficulty, Commander, I believe that Dong Fangpei is not so stupid. Is that so? Du Shaoqing's rhetorical question seemed to be very oppressive at this moment. He stared into Shimin Jin's eyes and said self-deprecatingly, or, he wants to use his own stupidity to get rid of a future opponent for me? When did I become so low in your eyes that I could be threatened by Su Lu? More importantly, haven't I taught you that on the battlefield, the most intolerable thing is to have other thoughts in your mind other than winning or losing? Du Shaoqing scolded coldly, and you can't have selfish thoughts. Chapter 522. After this battle, I will recommend to the Ministry of National Defense to suspend Dong Fangpei's authority, said Du Shaoqing expressionlessly. You don't need to plead for him. Shimin Jin did not plead for Dong Fangpei, because she knew very well what kind of persevering and cold temperament the teacher she was determined to follow had. Once he made a decision, unless a higher-ranked general directly used military orders to suppress him, he would not make any changes. Understood. Shimin Jin cleanly changed the topic. According to the calculations, it will be very difficult for the Green Dragon Mountain Vanguard to survive these few days in the geomagnetic storm zone. Even if all 3 regiments of the 17th Division arrive, it will probably be too late. After all, the weather conditions there are too harsh, and the Empire has gathered all the remnants of their forces, so the difference in strength is too great. War is fought by people, but we definitely cannot ignore the use of equipment. Du Shaoqing said in a low voice, whether or not the Empire's remaining forces have enough ammunition to sustain continuous high-intensity attacks is itself a problem. If Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu can fix the command system of the Green Dragon Mountain Division, they might be able to hold on. The question and answer between the two of them was very much like a conversation between a teacher and a student in a military academy. In reality, in Du Shaoqing's military experience, he had never been stingy with his subordinates' command standards. Shimin Jin listened intently to her teacher's analysis, but her mood was different from previous years, and a trace of doubt grew in her indifference. The battle philosophy of the federal forces had always been vaguely divided into 2 types. One was heavy equipment, and the other was heavy command and daily training. The graduation demonstration the Ministry of National Defense had held at the training base was to show the senior officers of the army what kind of changes the revolutionary MX mecha would bring to this battle. However, the results did not seem to be obvious. In this kind of disagreement, Du Shaoqing was undoubtedly the spokesperson of the latter, but now it seemed that he had made some kind of change himself. He had deployed the new MX mecha in large numbers in Iron 7 Division, creating all the conditions in battle to unleash the super attack power of the MX mecha group. This kind of change in command philosophy was obvious in those words earlier. Follow the rules. Dong Fangpei did not do anything wrong. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Du Shaoqing lowered his head to look at the electronic map and said indifferently, but since we didn't move at the beginning, we shouldn't move too quickly. The 17th Division was 1 step ahead of us. We don't need to fight for this kind of credit. Understood. Shimin Jin nodded, then his expression slightly congealed, and said in a low voice, I received a message from S1, I might have to go back in the near future. Du Shaoqing's hand that was holding the recorder paused for a moment. He was silent for a moment, but he did not say anything. He continued his tactical deduction work, as if he had given his silent consent. Shimin Jin faintly smiled, then saluted to him behind the table, then turned around and walked out of the room. Du Shaoqing raised his head and looked at the empty doorway. His thoughts drifted somewhere. His eyes, which were usually as cold as the sea of ice, showed a rare trace of doubt and sadness of introspection. Just like Shimin Jin and Dongfang Pei, who were determined to follow him, Shaoqing also had someone he admired in the Federation. At this time, he did not know why Shimin Jin had returned to the capital ring. Because it was that person's idea, he did not want to ask. He only had a vague feeling that something bad was happening, but he had acquiesced to this kind of thing happening. At certain times, not expressing one's opinion was the truest opinion. Du Shaoqing narrowed his eyes slightly. He saw the shadow in the depths of his heart, and a trace of extremely complicated emotions appeared. His right hand subconsciously exerted force, and with a crack, he broke the recorder. Black electrolytes sputtered out and fell on the electronic map, smearing a large stain on the blizzard area in the northeast direction. In the battle area in the snowfield and glacier, there was still a violent snowstorm. In the deep belly of the battlefield, on a snow hill near the front line of the Empire, the snow was almost as hard as ice due to the blowing of the wind. In the vision polluted by the dazzling snowflakes, there was nothing strange. There was only a black gravel-like thing floating in front of the snow hill. It seemed to have been swept here by a foreign wind and had no choice but to move here. Only when one got close to the black gravel-like thing could one roughly see that under the disguise of the stone was a high-definition scope probe specially made by the Federation. However, the Imperial Expeditionary Force, who had already been exhausted and were only holding on with their crazy spirit, would not carefully search the front line of their position in the blizzard. In their opinion, the surrounded Federal forces were even more dying than them. There was no way that they could get close to their barracks. Under the black gravel-like thing was a thin white line. The material of the white line was ultra-low temperature-resistant wire. In such a cold air, it could still maintain a sufficient curvature. The white line extended all the way to the bottom of the thick snow until it was several meters underground. In the snow cave deep underground, it was dark. The light from the sky struggled to leak in, but it could not illuminate the true color of the surrounding snow walls. The space in the snow cave was very small. Shi Qinghai, who was wearing an extremely thick winter suit, closed his eyes and curled up his body like a shrimp resting. He was holding the ACW great gun with a metallic luster in his arms, but at this time, he did not pay attention to the data transmitted to the light screen by the white line. He was like a hibernating bear, and no one knew when he would wake up. He had been hiding in this snow hill for 2 days. The water vapor on his chin had all condensed into ice strands, which looked a little funny. In fact, if it were not for the winter suit automatically heating his urine and circulating it around his body, his whole body would have been frozen into an ice pillar. Shi Qinghai woke up at some point. He opened his eyes and glanced at the light screen, then immediately closed his eyes again to save his physical strength and energy and to ensure that his body temperature did not drop too much. He had been staring at the periphery of this military camp for a long time, but he had not found any worthy targets. It really made him feel a little bored. 2 days ago, at the periphery of the war zone, he had quietly killed 3 low-level Imperial officers. However, he always felt that if he continued to do this, it would not be satisfying. The members of the Trinity Society were armed with the fiercest guns in the universe. They were characters who had even assassinated Macklin. If they were to simply snipe some stupid low-level officers of the Empire, they would be buried in this snowstorm. This kind of death was really not worth it. It was not very spectacular and did not have any sense of beauty. Therefore, he began to move toward the interior of the Empire. Between the crisscrossing bullets above his head, under the eyes of countless people, he moved forward and forward. He despised the god of death and the people of the Empire, and quietly arrived at this snow hill. It was hard to imagine how Shi Qinghai had managed to sneak through this 9-kilometer journey and how he had not been discovered by anyone. It was incredible that he was so fierce. In the snow cave, he suddenly opened his eyes again. He furrowed his beautiful eyebrows and cursed silently. He took out a bottle of spray from the equipment bag next to him and carefully sprayed it around the snow cave. The ultra-low temperature of the liquid nitrogen instantly made the snow wall that was showing signs of softening suddenly firm up. He had done this many times before so that he could carefully maintain the appearance of this snow hill without any changes. However, there was one thing that made the fearless Mr. Sure extremely angry. He had searched the regiment headquarters of the advance force for half a night, but he still could not find a camouflage targeting probe suitable for snow. After finishing the routine work, the surrounding temperature became even colder. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes and glanced at his watch. He found that it was already early in the morning, so he forced himself to wake up and stop sleeping. The watch on his wrist looked like a federal military standard, but in fact, it was a modified product sent by Su Lu. There were many practical small tools on it. Every time he looked at his watch in the snow cave, Shi Qinghai would think of his brother who was as stubborn and stupid as a rock most of the time. He thought silently that it might be difficult to see him again. But more often than not, Shi Qinghai was thinking about other things. He quietly looked at the hologram that popped up on his wristwatch. He looked at the beautiful woman in red and the cute little guy in the woman's arms. A trace of satisfaction flashed across his handsome face. More than 20 uncamouflaged MX mechas were mixed in with even more snow armors. Countless engine roars of different tones mixed together and shook the snow off the surface of the mechas. This troop made of steel didn't care about whether or not their whereabouts would be exposed. They were so silent and open that they even seemed arrogant as they moved forward happily in the snow. It was just that they strangely maintained a uniform speed and didn't show the anxiety that such a combat posture would show. In the Federation's 17th Division 1st Regiment, their regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel He Lei, was very anxious at this time. He sat in the command electronic control vehicle and scolded with a dark face, an entire regiment, circling around in the snow for 2 days, and in the end, actually circled back to the starting point. What use do I have for you guys? The geomagnetic storm in this area is too strong. Long-wave communication is completely cut off, and that side filter signal hasn't reappeared, the commander of the electronic control company explained with a gloomy expression. What's the use of explaining to me? We secretly came out to provide support, or rather, we disobeyed military orders to come here. If we can't find that ambushed Green Dragon Mountain troop, we will become the biggest joke. He Lei didn't know that the command center had already decided to provide support to Green Dragon Mountain's vanguard. Thinking about his current situation and what could happen on the battlefield, he roared furiously, to put it bluntly. I don't care about the lives of those monkeys from Green Dragon Mountain, but if we are late and cause the instructor to die, before I take out my gun and commit suicide, I will definitely kill all of you first. The tracked armored vehicle undulated slightly on the snowy ground. The atmosphere in the vehicle was very stifling. The electronic control soldiers in the 1st Regiment were very gloomy. Facing this kind of tyranny of nature, it was easy for humans to appear helpless. In reality, they didn't believe that the technical director Su Li's 2 mechas would be able to find the trapped troops from Green Dragon Mountain in this snowy region unless they were lucky. After venting his anger, He Lei immediately regained his calm. As an officer that the Federation focused on nurturing, his brain spun quickly for a moment and he thought of something. Returning to the starting point isn't a bad idea. Only idiots like us would use the most advanced electronic positioning at this time. The instructor entered the geomagnetic storm area from here. Gu Shifeng said that the side filter could be located. Pass down my orders, He Lei roared. Spread out in a straight line. Maintain a distance of 20 kilometers between the 2 sides. Move forward at the highest speed. The mecha groups can leave the main unit and spread out in a fan shape. Keep an eye on the sun in the sky and the moon in the night. Just shoot. Whoever is lucky enough to hear the first gunshot, I will give him the first award. Direction, north of northeast. Chapter 523. Done. Shang Qiu looked at the diagram on the screen of the workbench, and a smile appeared on her haggard face. She had not slept for almost 30 hours, causing her body to be extremely tired. However, at this moment, her spirit seemed to have returned to her body, causing her voice to be clear and bright. Hearing her voice, the people in the barracks burst into cheers. Everyone who was busy repairing the command system all clenched their fists tightly, a heavy sense of accomplishment growing in their hearts. Su Lu hung the string of tools back onto his belt, allowing these metal tools to hit his butt like wind chimes. He smiled and said, changing to the shortwave receiver, "I didn't think that it would, cough cough, actually work." The violent coughing made him bend over, and even using his fist to cover his mouth was unable to stop it. Instead, it made the coughing sound as unpleasant as muffled drums. Bai Yulan looked at him worriedly, passing over the water cup and pills in her hand. Su Lu lowered his head and looked at the light blue pills in his palm. He could not help but shake his head. Ever since he had followed Uncle Feng Yu and learned those 10 strange postures and developed that strange power in his body, how long had it been since he had gotten sick? Who would have thought that once the virus attacked his body, the reaction would be so severe? After drinking the pills, he coughed as he said, "The debugging work still needs to continue. The geomagnetic storm is too strong now. I don't know if this kind of messy equipment will have enough power to cover the radius. The most important thing is, cough, it has already been a few days. The two camps at the snowy peaks may not have been fully connected long ago, so the scanning here will take a little longer." In this short sentence, he was interrupted by coughing several times. Shang Qiu asked worriedly, "Can you still hold on?" Everyone in the room looked at Su Lu silently and worriedly. Everyone knew that he had not slept for a few days, and in the intervals between the repair work, he even had to separately operate the mecha with Bai Yulan and Xiong Linquan to block the increasingly crazy attacks of the Empire people. With such high intensity and even terrifying energy consumption, even a man made of iron would probably fall to the ground. "I'm okay." Su Lu gave a simple reply. Shortly after, he coughed painfully as he arched his body. His face was completely red, but his eyes were filled with worry. He was not worried about his own body, but rather, he was worried about the current situation of the battle. The attacks of the people of the Empire were becoming more and more frenzied. No one knew how long the Green Dragon Mountain Regiment headquarters could hold on for. Hurried orders, curses, and the hoarse voice of the staff officers transmitting information could be heard from the command room on the side. The battle had always been in an intense state, and the situation was abnormally tense. In the early morning, the Empire had sent out a suicide squad. Relying on their somewhat shabby equipment, they had actually broken through the Federation's second line of defense. The 500 soldiers of the Green Dragon Mountain's vanguard had been forced to retreat extremely deeply. They had no choice but to give up the best flat-shooting snowy plains to the enemy. Under such circumstances, as long as the remaining Imperial Expeditionary Force gathered another 2,000 people and launched a group charge with the help of the remaining mechas, the final high ground of Green Dragon Mountain would be extremely dangerous. But strangely, some sort of disagreement seemed to have occurred among the higher command levels of the Imperial armies. Perhaps it was because of the situation that Commander Li Ming had predicted that day, or perhaps it was because of some unexpected incident, but after dawn, the attacks of the Empire had slowed down. "If we can contact those 2 battalions, immediately mark out their positions and gather on the battlefield according to Plan 387 drawn up before the battle. Move closer to the direction of 535. 112, 2. The execution time is tentatively set at 10:00 at night." Commander Li Ming, whose face was full of stubble, had just received the good news that the command system was about to be fixed. His spirits were lifted slightly. On one hand, he was analyzing the possible tactics that the Imperial armies could use, while on the other hand, he was preparing for the gathering of the entire army. "Commander, an Empire mecha has come alone, requesting for a mecha duel." A staff officer walked into the room with a strange expression and reported to Li Ming. Li Ming's eyebrows rose, his eyes filled with disbelief. He had heard of this before. Back in the days on the Empire's mainland, when the two armies were locked in a battle to the death, there had indeed been such an ancient mecha duel. However, the current situation was that the Empire had the absolute advantage. The other party actually dared to arrogantly or stupidly request a mecha duel. What was wrong with them? Are you sure it's just one mecha? And not a mixed mecha team attack like the previous few times? He frowned and confirmed. In the past few days, the Empire, who had been somewhat anxious, had finally thrown their mecha into a frontal attack. Their side, who had already used up all of their electromagnetic bombs, was having a difficult time. If it weren't for the two white MXs from the 17th Division, their position would have been broken long ago. The Empire can't bear to lose too many people, so they want to suppress our morale? The deputy commander guessed hesitantly, or, they still can't be sure whether we still have electromagnetic bombs, so they're afraid that we'll trick them, so they sent an Empire mecha to its death. Using a naked young girl to look at us, are we all becoming eunuchs? Li Ming lowered his gaze slightly and said, let the mecha infantry company prepare to carry the rocket launchers. If that mecha really wants to charge over, I'll go. If the Empire finds out that we haven't used the electromagnetic bombs yet, they'll definitely understand. Su Lu lifted the curtain and walked over. His face was unhealthily pale. The mecha outside the camp isn't a remnant of the Moonwolf group. It should be a member of General N's personal mecha squad. Bai Yulan lowered her head slightly and silently looked at the tips of her feet. Everyone in the regiment knew that Su Lu had used up too much energy and his body was very weak. Logically speaking, he should have taken the initiative to fight, but he knew that his hands in his pockets had been trembling ever since the end of the last battle. After the arduous continuous battle, they were lucky not to have suffered any serious injuries, but their bodies were already on the verge of collapse. Li Ming's expression became serious. He was about to say something, but found that Su Lu had already brought Bai Yulan back to the room next door. Then, the low rumbling sound of the mecha and the static sound of the self-check came from the other side. He couldn't help but shake his head and sit back in his chair. He began to silently bless the person who was about to fight in a way that didn't conform to his ideals. Don't just stand there. Debug and scan at the same time. Don't interrupt. Su Lu said to the people from Green Dragon Mountain as he climbed up the mecha. They all had complicated looks in their eyes. The simple act of climbing seemed so difficult at this moment. Su Li's expression was as silent and calm as usual. He didn't know how long he could last, but he knew that this time it wouldn't be a problem. He didn't want to die like this in the cold winter. He really wanted to know if Shi Qinghai was safe. However, the battle was intense and tense. He didn't have time to look for that guy, nor did he have time to feel sorry for himself. He could only repeat the monotonous process of climbing. A black and green mecha from the Empire stood solemnly in the middle of the snowy field. This snowy field was extremely wide. It was in the middle of the battle between the Federation and the Empire. There was no clear light shining down, only the wind and snow blowing gently. It was like a jade jewel with a sword in hand. The sporadic gunshots in the surroundings had already stopped. The soldiers from both sides were lying on the snowy ground, nervously watching the scene in front of them. Their hearts were filled with nervousness, excitement, and uneasiness. They almost couldn't feel the cold of the snow. The officers from both sides also walked out of their respective camps, silently watching this rare mecha battle through the screen. The MXT slowly walked out of the high ground where the Green Dragon Mountain troops were located. It then gradually accelerated towards the center of the snowy field. The rhythmic sound of the engine penetrated the wind and snow, entering everyone's ears. The soldiers from the Mecha Repair Company who had worked together with Su Lu for a long time finally couldn't help but rush out of the barracks. They stood in a row, nervously looking into the distance. The originally snowy white mecha had already become tattered after days of arduous battles. Especially the alloy plates on the surface of the mecha, they had been dyed gray and black by the intense gunfire of the Empire people. They actually looked somewhat ugly. I am the Empire's level 4 mecha warrior, Xiao Jia. The black and green mecha proudly and calmly stood in its original position, unmoving. The mecha's external loudspeaker system transmitted the powerful and oppressive voice of the pilot in the cockpit. The ugly MXT didn't reply, only silently increasing its speed. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers could no longer hear the engine humming that they trusted so much. They could only see a line of snow extending. The front end of the line of snow crashed heavily into the black and green mecha. And then the black and green mecha flew up. And then, there was no more and then. In the world of the snowstorm, no one could hear the loud sound of metal colliding. They could only see a scene like a silent drama in front of their eyes. Everyone stared with wide eyes, unable to recover for a long time. Not long after, the white MXT returned to the camp. The cockpit opened, and Su Lu climbed down. He walked to Shang Qiu's side, rubbed his sore brows, and said, "Continue debugging." Shang Qiu smiled and began to check the data. In fact, she hadn't even left the chair just now. Xiong Linquan hugged a heavy gun and leaned against the wall. Looking at Boss who had returned to work, he couldn't help but shake his head and laugh. Bai Yulan slowly climbed onto the mecha. Her hands were trembling because of exhaustion, and she began to do post-battle maintenance. After a while, her willowy eyebrows suddenly twitched. She stopped what she was doing and leaned against the alloy plates outside the engine compartment. She lit a 37 brand cigarette and began to smoke happily. Silence passed, silence returned. The Imperial mecha was buried in the sea of snow. The MXT mecha's engine was only slightly warm, not burning at all. The three of them were the very few people who hadn't left the room earlier. This was because they had a kind of absolute, even blind, confidence in Su Lu. However, although the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers had seen Su Lu operate mecha in battle before, they were still so excited by this scene that they found it hard to control themselves. Looking at the back of that extremely ordinary figure in front of the control panel, their emotions were complicated to the extreme. In the snowstorm outside the room, that Imperial Wolf mecha lay silently in the snow. The spark of liquid oil ignited by the electric sparks was instantly suppressed by the snowstorm. No one could have predicted that at this moment, another thing would happen. Chapter 524. The Empire's wolf mech lay on the snowfield like a frozen giant corpse. A moment later, 1/3 of it was covered by the wind and snow. It looked miserable. This was the Imperial Expeditionary Force's most advanced mech. The pilot inside was the most powerful level 4 mech warrior in the Imperial armies. However, he had been defeated so thoroughly. However, the senior officers of the Empire who had been silently watching the battle did not show any signs of relief or fear because of this scene. Through these few days of battle, they had preliminarily confirmed the identity of the pilot in the Federation's white mech. Today's challenge was just a final confirmation to unify the thinking of the Army Command. The Norman officer's light blue eyes flashed with a trace of mockery. In a cold voice, he said, "Everyone, I don't care which army you were in the past. Don't forget, your army is gone. Now I am in command of this battle. This may be our last battle, so I hope you can listen to my command." As the most trusted subordinate of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's commander, Lieutenant General Ambly, the Norman officer had taken over the command of the army. He did not turn around. Using his blue eyes, he looked at the Federation's position in the distance. He said softly, "I think you should understand now that the Federation forces have used up all their electromagnetic beam bombs. They are not deliberately luring our mech warriors to charge." An Imperial colonel behind him frowned and said, "The mech has charged a few times. They did not use any electromagnetic beam bombs, but what's the difference between this and today?" "How can you be sure?" "Because that pilot is called Su Lu. The General Staff Department has done the calculations. In 3 days, he has fought 12 times consecutively. No matter how good he is, he should not be able to hold on much longer. If the Federation's commander had other methods, he would definitely not dare to risk letting him fight again. The style of a mech battle can determine the current physical condition of the pilot. Don't you think his performance today was too fierce and anxious? As for why the Federation's commander should not let the Federation pilot take the risk. If you had watched more of the Federation's television programs, perhaps you would have understood better. The Norman officer recalled the scene when the old general had asked him to learn the language of the Federation. He could not help but have a slight expression on his face. He wondered if the old general had recovered after returning to the base below the glacier, and if he had woken up from his coma. If it wasn't for the fact that General Umbri was unconscious and unable to command, this ambush wouldn't have been so difficult. Norman thought gloomily. His blue eyes flashed with a hint of decisiveness as he said, "Follow the original plan." The first temporarily reorganized brigade of the snowfield would launch its attack at 12 o'clock that evening. Second temporary reorganized brigade in reserve. The words stopped there. This outstanding young officer of the Empire had long given up on the idea of returning to his hometown. He only wanted to command a beautiful ambush battle and die in the snow border. Unfortunately, a bullet flew from the sky and hit him, stopping his beautiful plan. With a muffled bang, a streak of blood spurted out from his eye socket, shattering the deep blue pupils into pieces that merged with the white clouds. Almost at the same time, an even larger streak of blood spurted out from the back of his head. The Norman officer, who was missing a large chunk of his head, fell heavily into the snow. He did not even struggle or twitch. He died just like that. The soldiers in front of the barracks of the Imperial Expeditionary Force stared with wide eyes. It took a moment for them to come to their senses. Cries of alarm and anger rose and fell one after another. They began to angrily search for the Federation snipers around the camp. On a snow hill 3 kilometers away, the surface of the snow trembled slightly. A high-speed sniper bullet that could not be seen with the naked eye flew out from the soft snow and killed an Imperial high-ranking officer. The black gravel on the snow silently sank like a supernatural event. The storm rolled the snow around on the ground. In an instant, all traces were buried, leaving behind only a vast expanse of white. It was truly clean. In the underground snow cave, Shi Qinghai wiped the ice from his beard. He panted slightly as he closed the ballistic calculation program. Then, he hugged the cold ACW rifle and began to rest again. He was not worried that the Empire would be able to calculate his position through the trajectory and find him to begin a vicious pursuit. The ACW was the Federal military's most powerful single-soldier long-range weapon. Because it was extremely expensive, only 3 of them had been produced. They had never been assigned to the frontline troops. The Empire would never have imagined that this planet actually had a sniper rifle that could accurately blow up a person's head from 3 kilometers away. Therefore, it was very difficult for their search range to extend to his hiding place. He did not use tungsten alloy tail fins, nor did he use the magnetic resonance killing effect. He also did not use the high-velocity composite armor-piercing hard-ink bullets that could penetrate a mech's alloy shield at short range. Shi Qinghai only used the most common standard sniper bullet of the ACW to complete this difficult, silent, and tedious, yet earth-shattering mission of hiding for several days. In order to satisfy his obsession of dying a beautiful death, he hid in the snow cave until he did not know the sun. Only when he saw the icy tears flowing out of his eyes did he finally find the opportunity to choose the Imperial officer who was clearly an important character and who stood proudly at the very front. It was a pity that pair of mesmerizing blue eyes. In the gloomy snow cave, Shi Qinghai relaxed and closed his eyes. Because of his thinness, the corners of his lips were deeply sunken. Gradually, a trace of a proud smile appeared. It was extremely enchanting. The Federation did not have any information on the electromagnetic beam bomb. Because of the wrong judgment of the Norman officer, they came to a similar conclusion. Because of this point, the Empire's attack did not stop because of the sudden death of the highest commander. They did not even appear to be panicking. More than 5,000 soldiers of the Empire, under the cover of a few armored vehicles and mechs, silently and quickly split into 3 directions. Under the accompaniment of the night, they launched their final frenzied attack on the Green Dragon Mountain camp. The whistling sound of bullets pierced through the sky. The bright light of the explosions illuminated the entire snowy plains. The flares fired by the Green Dragon Mountain troops were like the lanterns of the S3 Flowing Fire Festival. They quietly hung in the air. However, after a short moment, they were blown away by the snowstorm and quickly extinguished. They were extremely resentful, but they could no longer find the feeling of quietly falling. The 30 degrees east position has been broken through. The 2nd Anti-Infantry Mine Array is ready to detonate. 3, 2, 1. Detonate. Hold the line for me. Hold the line for me. Within the headquarters of the Green Dragon Mountain Vanguard Group, there were anxious and hoarse shouts like this. Fortunately, during the day, the command system had already been completely repaired. After being isolated outside the snowy peaks, the 2 reinforced battalions that had not received any news for several days finally stepped onto the path of the entire army. They just so happened to be at the edge of the war zone, restraining a large portion of the Empire's main force's energy. Otherwise, this highland might have long been taken down by the Empire. Even so, the battle situation was still tense and dangerous to the extreme. All around the highland, there were soldiers of the Empire who did not fear death and even longed to return to their homeland. This kind of charge that did not care about the price of death was something that even the well-trained and disciplined Green Dragon Mountain troops could not hold on for much longer. The mechanical repair company had been thrown in, the logistics soldiers had also been thrown in. The majority of the entire regiment headquarters had been thrown into the front lines of the battle. Therefore, the camp seemed somewhat empty. The anxious voices of the staff officers, under the influence of the echoes, seemed somewhat hollow and heavy. At this kind of time, specific orders could no longer bring too much of an effect to the battle situation. The anxious and hoarse voice of orders in the room could only give the front lines some mental encouragement, telling those soldiers who were fighting bravely while bathed in blood that the regiment headquarters was still there. They had not left, they had not surrendered, and they had not fallen. Commander Li Ming passed the last cup of coffee to Shang Qiu beside him. Within his sunken eyes, there was no sorrow, nor was there despair. He and his troops had already done everything they could. All that was left was to see what kind of fate the heavens would arrange for them. Shang Qiu gripped the handle of the coffee cup tightly. Her square-rimmed glasses held an extremely complicated, indescribable emotion. She did not know if she would be able to survive tonight, but she was more worried about the safety of Su Lu and the others. 2 battered white MXT mecha stood guard at the most dangerous part of the battlefield in the dark night, like hungry wolves or tired tigers. Although the controls of the mecha were messy and sluggish, they still valiantly slaughtered all the Empire mecha that pounced at them. The 2 people in the cockpit were already in the most dangerous situation. The speed at which Bai Yulan's trembling hands entered the controls was already unimaginably slow. Holding onto Dalin's rotary machine gun, Xiong Linquan, who stood guard at the lower edge of the high ground, continued to fire fiercely like a god. He swept the densely packed Empire soldiers to the ground, but there was no end to them. Tonight, he did not have the protection of the old members of Group 7 by his side. The hard ceramic bulletproof vest on his body had long been destroyed in several places. Perhaps the next bullet would end his angry roar. Right at the most dangerous moment, the trapped Green Dragon Mountain troops let out a final roar, forcibly halting the relentless onslaught of the Empire soldiers. No one had given up yet, because they believed that their own troops, the Federation troops, would definitely come to their aid. As long as they could hold on for another hour, even if it was just 1 minute, perhaps a miracle would happen. Boom boom boom. Concentrated explosions rang out below the high ground. Bright light flashed, but did not disappear immediately. Because in the flat area of the snowy valley in the southwest direction, a bright flare was rising in spirals. Beneath the light, the silhouette of a Federation MX mecha could be seen within. Immediately after, to the left and right of this Federation MX mecha, on the black line at the edge of the snowy high ground nearly 30 kilometers away, a second, a third, more than 10 Federation MX mecha lined up in a row, appearing within the people's field of vision. Then, without any hesitation, they charged towards the battlefield at high speed. Further behind them, who knew how many Federation heavy armored vehicles were rushing over at full speed? The heavy humming of their engines converged in one place, piercing through the heavens. The faint rumbling of their engines could be heard faintly. In the deep winter of year 69 of the constitutional era, the 1st Regiment of the new 17th Division, rushing to the aid of the ambushed Green Dragon Mountain troops, finally arrived at the battlefield under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Hilei. Using a rigid and arduous but effective net drawing method, the countless mecha and vehicles were like countless sharp military swords, maintaining a net spread pattern as they charged viciously into the snowy plains. Chapter 525. The Imperial Expeditionary Army had spent decades excavating countless underground fortifications in the glacial zone of planet 5460. The connection points of the fortifications had been excavated into empty underground bases. These bases were deep in the rock and covered with an extremely thick layer of hard ice. Even if the Federation launched an energy cannon attack from space at all costs, they would be safe and sound. Last year, in the depths of autumn, the Federation military used Jian Shuayer's victory concert to successfully lure the Imperial Expeditionary Force out. They accurately grasped the location of almost all the ice bases of the Empire. In the fierce battle that followed, most of the ice bases of the Empire were destroyed. Only 2 or 3 secret bases in the extreme north survived. In the depths of the underground base numbered Rose 3, the commander of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, Lieutenant General Ambly, finally woke up from his coma. The complete medical equipment and large doses of hormone injections here saved the old man's life. Ambly put down the file in his hand and remained silent. The 2 regiments that he had spent so much effort to preserve were actually not able to destroy a regiment of the Federation. This was really sad news. Although there was a huge gap in equipment between the 2 sides, and the sudden illness had a very bad effect on the command of the Empire's troops. But how did the war end up like this? Ambly should have been depressed or irritable, but his weak face did not show the slightest bit of emotion. In fact, he had already seen the result of the Imperial Expeditionary Force many years ago. As long as the Empire was unable to break through those 2 damned spatial tunnels, his seemingly powerful forces would eventually crumble under the relentless attacks of the Federation. It was just a matter of whether that day was early or late. Ambly calmly picked up the notebook beside his bed and took out the royal pen that His Majesty had given him. He began to write today's diary. At this moment, he thought of the young officer with a pair of beautiful blue eyes who had just died. The tip of the pen paused heavily on the white paper. The difference between the Empire and the Federation is in equipment, technology, and economy. But this is not a problem that cannot be fixed. The ambush this time was able to trap the enemy in a hopeless situation thanks to the blessing of the heavens. The abnormal geomagnetic storm proved some of my previous conjectures. The Federation's technology is advanced, and they have the most advanced equipment. Plus, they have the highly efficient central computer as the computing core. They are used to highly automated combat methods. Once they are in the current situation, it is difficult for them to change this habit. They cannot use the simple and even crude combat methods of the Empire. Therefore, in the geomagnetic storm environment, our troops can skillfully use the old-fashioned codes to communicate. Their equipment and habits that can't work has become a burden that is difficult to bear. Unfortunately, a certain regiment of the Federation that is being besieged by us belongs to the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain. This unit has been fighting guerrilla warfare in Green Dragon Mountain for several decades and is very good at facing this kind of low automatic battle situation. If it was the federal government that was besieging them this time, perhaps the battle would have ended faster. Embry took a few weary breaths, then leaned forward slightly and continued writing. The Federation's main force is not used to fighting without their central computer. This has been fully demonstrated in the past homeland defense battles. What I am thinking is, once the Federation army invades the Empire's homeland again, should we adopt a scorched earth strategy and consciously move part of the battlefield to a planet with a harsh environment? Imperial officers had always had the habit of writing diaries, especially expeditionary army troops. Because there was no diary, it was difficult to understand the boring military life far away from home. Ambly was the same. But today, when he wrote to this point, his pen seemed to be dignified. After thinking for a moment, he seriously wrote in his diary, "The Expeditionary Army's defeat is not far away, but in my opinion, we can hold on for another 3 to 5 years. Perhaps by that time, the military will have successfully developed a way to break through the space channel." But unfortunately, His Majesty's order disrupted all of our troops' deployment. Most of the bases in the lower glaciers were destroyed or occupied by the Federation. Our troops lost strategic depth, and defeat is inevitable. My life may be coming to an end. Before I die, my doubts are all due to His Majesty's order. Huai Fu Chai. Although he is a bit neurotic, as an emperor, he should not be crazy to this extent. Then, I want to know, what is the relationship between this Federation woman named Jian Shuier and the imperial family of the Empire? With a question that had never been said but was like a stone pressing down on his heart, Ambly slowly closed the diary and pressed the small bell beside him. A few imperial officers who stayed behind quickly walked over. One of them quickly reported the situation on the battlefield. With an ugly expression, he said, "The enemy's new 17th Division, the last 2 regiments also rushed to the battlefield yesterday morning. Most of our troops' equipment is damaged, and we are severely lacking in ammunition. The 1st Temporary Brigade has continuously retreated, but we are still unable to shake off the enemy's pursuit. Because of the geomagnetic storm, we are unable to make an accurate calculation of the Federation's forces. We can't even make an estimate. We only know that the enemy's 7th Division should also be on the way." The officer said in a heavy tone, "Commander, the 2nd Integrated Brigade must be thrown in. Otherwise, not a single person from the 1st Brigade will be able to withdraw." In this ambush battle, everyone in the Federation thought that the Empire would only be able to form a single integrated brigade. No one would have thought that the Imperial Expeditionary Force still had a final trump card hidden up their sleeves. Hearing the 2 words 7th Division, the yellow spots on Ambly's face suddenly lit up. He thought of that Federation general named Du Shaoqing and the desperate attacks and defenses that had taken place on this planet in the past year. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he said without hesitation, "Order the 2nd Integrated Brigade to immediately retreat and scatter into the tunnels. No reinforcements are allowed." The officers beside the bed were shocked. They knew that their troops would definitely lose. Like the normal soldiers on the front lines, they were not afraid of death. However, it was very difficult for them to accept giving up on the troops that had been bitterly fighting for several days and nights. Since the enemy has moved, they must have put in all their forces. Only when the ratio of military strength is 4:1 or even 5:1, will we, the Federation, dare to let our Ace Division enter the geomagnetic storm zone. Ambly closed his eyes, and a trace of the unwillingness and disappointment of an old man grew in his heart. In his calculations, since the enemy was the anti-government army of Green Dragon Mountain, the Federation's government army would definitely not take the risk to come and help. His troops had the opportunity to use the internal political problems of the Federation to eat up this regiment bit by bit. Then, he would use the 2nd Brigade to ruthlessly eliminate the miscellaneous troops that the Federation might send out to deal with the political pressure. However, he did not expect that the Federation would actually not give up on this regiment. They had clearly been fighting within the Federation for many years. The 2nd Temporary Brigade must immediately retreat. He opened his eyes and said coldly, "Let us have the final bloody battle with the Federation in the underground tunnel. I am very curious. In a place like this, what can their new mecha do? Tell all the troops, every brave soldier of the Empire. We have to guard every alley and every door. Even if we have to use our own deaths to exchange for the enemy's death, no matter if we smash them with rocks or bite them with our fists, we have to make the Federation pay with countless deaths for every step they take." Ambly's voice was old and fierce. "Tell them that the time to show their loyalty to His Majesty has come." On the west side of the glacial snowfield, there were endless mountains. Occasionally, the snow on a few of them would be blown away by the strong winds high up in the sky, revealing the hard black limestone underneath. It added a bit of color to this monotonous white world, although it was also a cold color. The new 17 divisions of the Federation all entered the battlefield. The already exhausted Empire reorganized brigade immediately collapsed. Although the Empire still fought stubbornly and viciously, the huge difference in military strength and equipment caused the situation on the battlefield to become one-sided. The geomagnetic storm was gradually subsiding, but the interference to the electronic equipment was still great. The remnants of the Empire scattered and hid in the snowy peaks. The new 17 divisions chased after them. The entire battle area instantly expanded by more than 10 times. In the seemingly calm snowy plains and icy peaks, small-scale battles could erupt at any time. The Green Dragon Mountain vanguard that had fought until the sky turned dark and the earth turned dark, following the Federation's orders, slowly retreating south and leaving the battle area. However, there was a small team that stayed behind. Right now, they were walking slowly on the snowy ground below the rocky peak, as if searching for something. After hundreds of battles, the tattered white MXT mecha entered the battle once again after some initial repairs. The heavy body of the mecha left deep tracks in the snowy plains as it led the few armored vehicles behind it forward slowly. Suddenly, the crisp sound of a gunshot rang out from the front. The white MXT instantly bounced up, switching from forward mode to combat mode. Two thick and long alloy mechanical legs landed heavily on the ground, roaring as it ran forward. Xiong Linquan, who was on the armored vehicle, frowned the moment he heard the gunshot. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers beside him with faces full of worry also became nervous. Another unique and dull gunshot rang out. ACW. Xiong Linquan was incomparably shocked. He grabbed the collar of the Green Dragon Mountain soldier beside him and roared loudly, "Did you hear that? It's ACW." By the time the three armored vehicles rushed over with a roar, that small battle had already ended. The corpses of 7 or 8 Empire soldiers in tattered uniforms were lying on the ground. The white MXT mecha stood silently on the snowy plains, as if it was listening intently for some sound, searching for something important. However, the vast expanse of white ground was truly clean. Other than these dead Empire soldiers, Xiong Linquan and the soldiers on the armored vehicles searched diligently, but they could not find any trace of abnormalities. Right at this moment, a part of the faint shadow of the mecha suddenly protruded from the snow. Xiong Linquan vigilantly aimed the muzzle of his gun in that direction. A thin man crawled out from the snow, completely ignoring Xiong Linquan's muzzle. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the tall body of the mecha in the air and suddenly opened his mouth to laugh and say, "Get the hell down from me, or else I'll just shoot you." The cockpit of the mecha opened, and Su Lu, whose face was still somewhat haggard, jumped down. He said hoarsely, "Even ACW with hard ink bullets wouldn't be able to penetrate it. The alloy of the cockpit was custom-made and thickened by me." He walked in front of the thin man, his small eyes extremely bright. He said, "I thought you were dead." Shi Qinghai smiled and said, "I almost died, but I knew you wouldn't die." The two brothers hugged each other, pounding each other's back with force as they laughed heartily. However, they had not yet recovered from their serious illness in consecutive battles, and they had to defend the endless snowy caves and tread the cold plains by themselves. They were all at their weakest moments. Being pounded by these affectionate fists made them cough violently, until their eyes were wet. Chapter 526. The geomagnetic storm and snowstorm seemed to have agreed to disappear at the same time. The glacier at the extreme north of planet 5460 revealed its magnificent and solemn true appearance in front of everyone. The sides of a few lonely black rock peaks were dotted with a world of ice and snow that had accumulated over hundreds of millions of years. Against the backdrop of the blue sky, it was very beautiful. The sound of explosions came faintly from afar. The battle on this high ground had already ended. The remnants of the empire hidden in the ice and snow stubbornly resisted to the end, but in the end, they only turned into countless cold corpses. 2 white MXT mechas buzzed and exited battle mode. Their huge metal bodies slowly descended, quietly watching their own troops silently clean up the battlefield. The Federation had mobilized 2 fully mechanized ACE-integrated divisions and even more divisions. Under such an offensive, even if the remaining forces of the Imperial Expeditionary Force wanted to use a tragic suicidal counterattack to prove their loyalty to His Majesty, they could not hold on for much longer. In just 7 short days, the battle line had already advanced a few hundred kilometers to the north. The 1st Regiment of the new 17th Division that had launched the attack first was now at the very back. The Federation Command used this method to announce to all the troops that no matter how great your military achievements were, if you dared to not follow military discipline, like Lieutenant Colonel Healy, then no matter how rich the fruits ahead were, the command would not let you eat them. The troops in charge of cleaning up the remnants of the Empire before them was a mixed team of the 1st Regiment and a certain regiment from Green Dragon Mountain. They were somewhat unwilling and annoyed to follow the rear of the Federation troops, chewing on the frozen leftovers tastelessly in the glacier. Commander Healy could not stand this kind of depression and had been hiding in the command armored vehicle to sleep, not coming out at all. The cockpit door of the white MXT mecha slowly opened. Sulu, with messy hair, rubbed his eyes and stood on the door fastener. He looked at the battlefield around him. After a moment of silence, he took out a wrinkled light blue cigarette case from his military uniform, took out a dry cigarette, and stuffed it into his mouth. He used his trembling hand to turn on the lighter and moved closer. The weather was still very cold. He had just recovered from a serious illness and was wearing a thin pilot's uniform, so his hands were trembling. He did not light the cigarette at all, but his lips and lungs seemed to be numb from the cold between the glaciers. He did not notice this at all. He inhaled hard and looked at the white smoke that he exhaled in front of him, thinking that it was a cigarette. It wasn't until more than 10 seconds later that he realized something was wrong. He looked awkwardly at the cigarette, but that had no light at all. Then, he anxiously realized that the lighter was also broken. It was purely a subconscious action. Sulu reached his hand into the cockpit, grabbed the control stick, and quickly made a few movements. Following this movement, the gigantic MXT mecha beneath him began to move. The heavy alloy mechanical arms quickly flipped upwards with a clear metallic sound, fanning out a few plumes of snow in the air. Then, just as it was about to smash into the cockpit door of the mecha, it abruptly stopped. The black gun barrel of the MXT mech, which looked thicker than a tree trunk, was aimed at the cabin door, at his head. The soldiers in the snow raised their heads to look. A trace of surprise flashed across their faces because it looked like the pilot standing in the gigantic mecha wanted to commit suicide. Of course, no one believed that this pilot would commit suicide, so they were very curious about what exactly he wanted to do. Sulu held the cigarette in his mouth very naturally and moved closer to the air in front of him. There was a thick and terrifying gun barrel there. The special separated state Darlin's autocannon at the front of the mechanical arm had just stopped firing and was rotating. It looked calm as usual, glowing with a faint metallic luster, but in reality, its temperature was terrifyingly high. With a soft hiss, the cigarette ignited as soon as it came into contact with the metal of the gun barrel. Sulu narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath. He felt very happy, using a gigantic mecha weapon to light a cigarette gave people the feeling of using the main cannon of a battleship to fry fish. The Federation soldiers in all directions watched this scene. Their hearts surged with complicated and reverent emotions. This scene seemed to be deliberately made cool. What kind of precise microcontrol ability did this pilot need to have? If he made the slightest mistake in his control, that hot and thick gun barrel would probably immediately take his life. Movie King, light it up for me too. Shi Qinghai shouted loudly from the ground, his face full of ridicule. In his opinion, Su Lu was becoming more and more silent and cool. He didn't know if it was because he was stimulated by Du Shaoqing or because of the influence of that national girl, but he was really more like an actor. It was infuriating. Hearing his words, some of the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers who reacted quickly laughed out loud, while the soldiers of the new 17th Division glared at Shi Qinghai angrily. As the trump card of the new 17th Division, or rather the newest generation signboard, Su Lu held a very high position in the hearts of the normal soldiers. Su Lu just smiled and sat at the joint of the hatch. His right hand gripped the control stick and shook it twice. With a whistling sound, the heavy mechanical arm of the MXT pierced through the air and pressed down on Shi Qinghai's head like a small mountain. The shadow instantly enlarged and then stopped changing. The terrifyingly huge gun barrel came to an abrupt stop just a few centimeters in front of Shi Qinghai. Shi Qinghai's expression was a little stiff, and his lips trembled with the cigarette in his mouth. Even someone as fierce as him was shocked by this scene. After a moment, he lowered his head and lit the cigarette between his lips. After taking a deep breath, he used his fingers to pinch the filter and shouted up, "You want to scare me to death? No way." A few meters in the air, Su Lu sat on the edge of the cabin door. His 2 feet, which were wearing anti-slip military boots, kicked lightly in the breeze. His face was filled with a happy smile. His neat white teeth were dazzling under the cold sunlight. He was like a child with a clean and simple mind. Right at this moment, the hatch of the white MXT mecha beside him also opened. Bai Yulan stepped on the sturdy hatch, took out a cigarette from the pack, and put it between her lips. Then, she looked over and smiled. The Federation soldiers who were cleaning up the battlefield below the 2 mechas also excitedly squeezed over. They all took out cigarettes from their arms and looked up at the sky expectantly. Seeing this scene, Su Li's smile instantly disappeared. Just like he lay, he turned around and hid in the cockpit. No matter how many people outside the cockpit called out, he wouldn't show his face again. In the cleanup operations that followed, Su Lu and Shi Qinghai, this pair of brothers who had not seen each other for a long time, finally had the chance to fight side by side for an extended period of time. That innate tacit understanding that began when they passed cigarettes through the iron door under the sunlight appeared once again. Mr. Shi, who had received the Federation's formal military academy education and Green Dragon Mountain special agent training, displayed his outstanding and proud side to the Federation's officers. No matter if it was a complicated tactical deduction or a specific battle plan arrangement, he could easily give the best answer through his small notebook and the specialized grid lines on the electronic map. Su Lu, on the other hand, led the well-equipped troops. Clean and efficient, he completed specific battle missions without any sloppiness. Even when the battlefield was far away, he could still appear at the place Shi Qinghai needed him to be. His execution ability was so strong that it made others speechless. One was the technical director of the new 17th Division, and was also Commander He Lei's respected instructor. He had a lot of say in the command of the troops. The other was the liaison officer jointly chosen by President Pabre and the leader of Nanshui. The military commander of the Green Dragon Mountain troops also greatly valued his opinion. The mixed troops of both sides gradually got used to the feeling of fighting together because of the existence of these 2 people. In the past few decades, the government troops and the anti-government troops, who had been at odds with each other and had been stained with each other's blood, actually became more and more familiar with each other. The initial hostility and indifference had unknowingly decreased by a lot. Last year at the base, someone mentioned that teacher Du Shaoqing was a member of the Trinity Association. At the time, the boss said that he knew 2 people from the Trinity Association. One was a secretary, and the other was in prison. At the time, you guys didn't think much of it and thought that the boss was joking. Beside the bonfire on the snowy ground, Bai Yulan quietly said to her comrades beside her, the person who is the secretary is in charge of specific affairs for one of the 7 major families. He is a character who can enter and leave the presidential palace at will. And this Mr. Shi is the one in prison. Now you should believe that on the day he was pardoned, you were also at Charter Square. Yes. Xiong Linquan hugged the gun and shook his head with emotion. The person who is qualified to enter the Trinity Association is indeed extraordinary. He should have been locked in the military prison together with the boss. Some rumors say that when Senator Macklin was assassinated in S2, it was him and the boss who did it together. To be honest, what I am most curious about is where he got this ACW. Haven't you thought about that big gun? I heard that it was specially approved by the president. Have you seen the president? Lan Xiaolong looked at Xiong Linquan and said mockingly. Of course I have. Last time when I accompanied the boss to the official residence for dinner, the president specially came to the lounge to see us. Did you forget? Xiong Linquan retorted angrily. Lan Xiaolong ignored him. A trace of complex emotions flashed through his eyes. He is more accurate with the gun than you. He is fiercer than Old Bai in close combat. His electrical control skills are no worse than Gu Shifeng's. His first aid skills are even better than Dong Zi's. His driving skills are better than Lu Jiao's. His grades in the military academy are even better than mine. In the past, I always thought that this guy Su Lu was already ridiculously fierce, like a monster. But now, I suddenly find that there is an all-around monster by my side. If there are more people like him, how are we going to survive? Lan Xiaolong was not sarcastic and said with emotion, this young master is indeed qualified to be a young master. Chapter 527. Shi Qinghai loved wine, really good wine. He would occasionally drink a bottle of Wenjun brandy Xianzang No. 3. He had a special fondness for oak red pearl, but his favorite had always been the amber Qingshou liquor. But no matter what kind, they were all the most expensive and luxurious wines in the Federation. When Su Lu was still a janitor at Yue University, he was very clear about his biggest hobby. He had once deeply suspected that this guy had spent all of his salary from the Federation Investigation Bureau and the secret funds from the 4 departments of Green Dragon Mountain on wine. Not bad, it's very strong. Shi Qinghai picked up the military water bottle and drank a mouthful of cheap wine. His beautiful eyebrows slightly raised as he said, in this world of ice and snow, I haven't drunk wine in a long time. Speaking of which, the Federation government is really something. Whether it's in terms of logistics or equipment, they give us this kind of differential treatment. This is the private collection that he sent over, it's not the standard equipment of the Ministry of Defense. Su Lu, who was sitting beside him, shook his head and said, I thought your resentment would be a lot less now. But you can't deny the existence of this difference. Shi Qinghai's eyes were slightly blurred. He pointed at the armored vehicles around the camp and said mockingly, look at the equipment of our troops, and then look at your equipment. Isn't it like the difference between a prince and a beggar? Su Lu was silent. After the Green Dragon Mountain troops were reorganized and moved to the front lines of the West Woods last year, he had seen many things with his own eyes. He knew that Shi Qinghai wasn't lying, but for some reason, he couldn't help but want to refute or explain. Because of Shi Qinghai and Zhang Xiaomeng, because of the fact that the Federal Central Computer told him that the uncle was the spiritual flag of Green Dragon Mountain, George Carlin, Su Lu had always had a kind of warm feeling towards the people of Green Dragon Mountain. He understood, appreciated, and sympathized with the efforts of these people. He had put this kind of warmth into practice in the Chrysanthemum Night Market. But because of the existence of people like Macklin and Nan Mingxiu, he also had some vigilance and uneasiness towards Green Dragon Mountain in the depths of his heart. The situation should gradually improve. If the Federation wants to achieve true reconciliation, it's not something that can be done in a day or two, he said softly. Shi Qinghai said sarcastically, I've never been as optimistic about the future of the Federation as you are. Those old politicians, those aristocratic families, even now, still couldn't wait for the people of Azure Dragon Mountain to die. This time, when the Vanguard group was ambushed, you were the only one who brought 2 mechas to be the hero. You once again put on a show of suicide. The rest of the government army didn't make a move. You should know what this means. Sulu fell silent and thought for a moment before saying, I don't think there's a need for a conspiracy theory. If the government really wants to borrow the hands of the Empire to wipe out the armed forces of Green Dragon Mountain, there are more direct methods. Besides, our division and the Iron 7th Division still managed to rush over in the end. This directly means that they have something on us. Shi Qinghai's gaze passed through the bonfire and looked at the quiet snowy plains in the distance. He said, those people are still somewhat afraid of the power of public opinion. Besides, there will always be Chu Tong who can respond to what I see as a liaison officer. You are the liaison officer personally appointed by the president. Since you want to respond, it means that you still trust him. In the Federation government, although there aren't many people like Mr. Pabre, there are still quite a few. You should at least have some confidence. Confidence? The Federation system has long since become a deformed product of the marriage between the 7 great families and the politicians. It's rotten beyond redemption. Pabre is a rare exception, but he can't change too many things. I don't know much about politics, but I've heard Li Xiaodong's explanation. The golden fusion algorithm was a very powerful attack by the government. It just so happened that this kind of bill that shook the foundations of the 7 great families was actually passed by the parliament. This means that Mr. President is not only an agitator who only knows how to make speeches, but also a man of action who has a lot of political wisdom and means of power. And don't forget, he has a cooperative relationship with the lady in the back mountain of Macho. With the influence of the Tai family behind the scenes, he can do a lot more things. The problem is that all partners can be abandoned. Right now, the military and the people support him, and it's at a critical juncture in the war with the Empire. That's why he can take advantage of this situation to forcefully implement his own reforms. But have you ever thought about it? If the federal military is also corrupted, what can he do? Shi Qinghai's gaze lowered slightly, and his tone was full of mockery. He said, as for the so-called public opinion, it's the easiest thing in the world to manipulate. During the last presidential election, during the Medellin project, there were so many students on the streets, burning slogans, and roadblocks. Did you and I not see it clearly? Su Lu was silent again. 2 years ago, the two of them fought side by side into the building of the Huanshan Four States Peace Foundation. Now, they had very different views in some aspects. This was a very normal thing. One was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation Government Army, and the other was an outstanding member of the anti-government army. Because of their positions, their perspectives on things would always be somewhat different. The most important thing was that Su Lu was always willing to wait for the bright future, while Mr. Shi, who was used to hiding in the deep sea, was very cautious in his bones. Just as the legendary intelligence leader of the Green Dragon Mountain said, the best spy must be a downright pessimist. After a long silence, Shi Qinghai looked at the depressed Li Du beside him and suddenly laughed loudly. Fortunately, this is not a melodramatic movie. Otherwise, in the future, we will definitely become 2 military brothers who walk on different paths because of different ideologies. In the end, we will draw guns against each other, tearful eyes, pull the trigger, and be in so much pain that we would rather die. Extremely stupid, a mess, Su Lu couldn't help but laugh and said, does this mean that the two of us don't have any real beliefs? The purpose of noble behavior should be people themselves. If people are used as means to achieve the goal, then this behavior can't be called noble. The so-called beliefs are the same. If there is a belief that needs to be protected by sacrificing beautiful feelings, it's fine to not have it. You can sacrifice yourself, but when your feelings involve others, you can't sacrifice yourself. Shi Qinghai replied. Su Le seemed to have felt something, and said thoughtfully, I said something similar to that to Zhang Xiaomeng on the Iron Tower in Linhai, but it was not as clear as your first sentence. These are the original words of George Carlin. When I was receiving special training in S2, the most painful thing was to recite the words of St. George, Shi Qinghai said with a smile. Su Le laughed, thinking that this uncle had never shown his philosophical side in front of him. Since he was young, he had lived in the Donglin district, which was not really barren, but was especially closed off and dull. He had never received a proper education, and the positive aspects of his outlook on life, if they could be called morals, had nothing to do with books or education. It was just a simple judgment passed down from hundreds of millions of Donglin miners. In the cold and cheerless Bell Tower Street, where the strong preyed on the weak, he had naturally developed such a temperament. It had to be said that it was a very strange thing. That uncle only taught him how to repair electrical appliances and gave him the best discount for prostitution. He definitely would not influence him from the perspective of rational education. On the contrary, after escaping from Donglin and entering Yue University, he met this rascal beside him, and some of his thoughts gradually became clear. Your letter has always been kept in the Wangdu apartment. From time to time, I would take it out and read it. Every time I read it, I would feel that I had gained something. Su Le looked at Shi Qinghai and said seriously. He had always thought that this good friend of his was his teacher in certain aspects. Shi Qinghai was slightly startled. After a hiccup, he said self-deprecatingly, at that time, teacher was betrayed, and my identity as a spy was exposed. I felt that there was no one in the world that I could trust, so I was a little scared. But I was unwilling to accept it, so it was rare that I became a literary youth. I will keep it well. When I am old in the future, I will look at it again and recall the hot-bloodedness of my youth. It should be quite fun. Su Le smiled. Unexpectedly, he remembered the long night of conversation he had with the West Woods Tiger in the Red Oil restaurant in Sunset Province. His expression became serious, and he repeated the contents of the conversation to seek the help of his best friend. Soldiers involved in politics? The Federation has a charter, so it should be difficult to do. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes. Although he was drunk, he was unusually cautious. He said, but if you think about it more deeply, the rules and regulations of the first charter state that computers must play the role of servers. This gives people the convenience of manipulating the first charter. It has even gradually become a tool of the upper class. This is a very scary thing. Actually, for the past few years, I have always had a question in my heart. Shi Qinghai picked up the military water bottle and took a big gulp of liquor. After a long pause, he said, the assassination at the Linhai State Gymnasium. Teacher and I were betrayed and framed. It seems that it was Medellin's idea. The Deputy Minister of National Defense, Yang Jingsong, and the young officers of the 2nd Military Region sent the officers to carry out the specific execution. This is the result of the investigation by the two of us, but I always feel that something is wrong with this matter. Hearing this, Su Le narrowed his eyes slightly. During the assassination attempt on Tai Ziyuan in Linhai State, Shi Qinghai and his teacher were betrayed by the organization, which directly affected their lives. Because of some kind of obsession, the two of them never gave up the investigation of the mastermind behind this incident. Even if they were enemies with the entire Federation, they bravely moved forward and silently investigated, until finally, they killed Medellin in the building. However, at this moment, Shi Qinghai had a different idea. There is one missing link. Shi Qinghai put the bottle of liquor down by his feet, raised a finger to Su Le, and said, there is one missing link between Medellin and Yang Jingsong. In that link, there is an active Federation officer with reddish-brown hair. This person should not be from either side, but he played a very important role. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find out who he is. Sulu lowered his head and said after a long silence, active officers are not allowed to dye their hair. That should be a disguise. It is very difficult to find clues in this regard. This is the only clue I have. That black-gloved subordinate of Medellin also does not know more about this officer. But I have a strong premonition that this person will fall into my hands because of his disguise in the future. At that time, I will give him a better wig. Shi Qinghai said with a smile. Chapter 528. Above the bitterly cold snowfield of the far north, the sun in the blue sky was devoid of any warmth, as if it was fake. At night, the bonfire in the barracks was fake, as if the heat had been frozen by the low temperature. It also seemed fake. Sulu tightened the white fox skin around his neck that he had given him in private. He took a big gulp of liquor from the military water bottle beside him and nodded slightly. Like Shi Qinghai, he used different methods to carry out his own perseverance, but he wasn't a good person. Now that he knew that there were some ambitious people hiding in the Federation, spying on him, or plotting something bigger, he definitely wouldn't be polite if he could find out who they were in the future. The cold night made him feel a little depressed because of the unknown appearance and background of the enemies. At this moment, Shi Qinghai, who was already drunk and even more charming, suddenly leaned over, as if he was about to say something. His left hand quietly reached under Shi Qinghai's butt and pulled out the chair. Sulu didn't fall down. He held the military water bottle and kept his body in the horse stance in the air. He looked at Shi Qinghai in astonishment, shook his head, and said, "You still like to play this kind of childish game." The two of them had known each other for almost 4 years, ever since the first cigarette was lit inside and outside the iron gate of Yue University. From the very beginning, Shi Qinghai liked to sneak up on Su Li's seat from time to time. He was just like a primary school student with excellent grades who was willing to tease a cheerful classmate because of boredom in class. "But you're still so boring. You never forget to train yourself under any circumstances, even when we're drinking." Shi Qinghai burped again. He looked at the empty space under Shi Qinghai's body with sympathy and anger. He shook his head and said, "Do you know where the term horse stance came from? It's the ugly posture of the previous dynasty's bigwigs who disregarded the spirit of the constitution and kept wild horses without permission. It's full of luxury and overflowing with the smell of oily skin. It's completely different from yours. I really don't understand why you still work so hard. Why do you have to do this? If you don't work hard to improve yourself, it's easy to die. I knew this before I went to the battlefield. Only when I went to the battlefield did I realize this was the truth." Sulu stood up and pulled the chair back under his butt. He sat down in a relaxed manner and said with a smile, "I think the training you received in the Federation's Investigation Bureau and the 4th Department was no easier than mine. But I won't make my life as boring as a machine because of this." Shi Qinghai said sarcastically, "Besides, the government has been trying to make you into a war hero, an idol figure. As long as you don't act stupidly, crazy and impulsively, danger will never come to you." At this point, he frowned and asked seriously, "Actually, I've always been very curious about the relationship between you and the Lees of Philadelphia." The answer involved many things, including Su Li's real past, his identity as a fugitive from the Federation, and even the disguised chip behind his neck. However, he didn't hesitate and said softly, "The army god is the younger brother of the old man, and also my teacher." Shi Qinghai was silent for a long time. He took a big gulp of wine and said with emotion, "Well, it is indeed nepotism. But I can accept that you are not Li Pifu's illegitimate son." He then said with a smile, "Although you don't need to explain, I still have to tell you that I will keep it a secret." Su Lu smiled and didn't say anything. He wondered if he should find a chance to tell more of his secrets in the future to scare this guy. There were many kinds of friends. Fair-weather friends could have a spiritual resonance. Old friends could also turn their backs on each other in an instant. He and Shi Qinghai had gone through life and death together. They had a deep mutual trust that was as hard as alloy. There was no need to keep too many secrets between them. With the Lees of Philadelphia as your backer, as long as that old man is alive, no one in the Federation will dare to mess with you. Shi Qinghai looked at him thoughtfully and warned, but you can't trust this relationship too much and make an incorrect judgment. The army god of the Federation was undoubtedly the most amazing big shot in the universe. In addition to his shocking military talent, this old man's political wisdom was also unfathomable. However, what made him the most fanatically worshipped and respected by hundreds of millions of people was his integrity, which was willing to sacrifice everything to protect the Federation. Su Lu understood this very well. Li Ruofu thought highly of him and groomed him. Apart from compensating Uncle Feng Yu, a large part of it was for the sake of the Federation. The old man very much hoped that he could be like himself in the future and become a fuel to continue burning for the Federation. Without this premise, all the appreciation and cultivation would be for naught. Just like the assassination that happened in Sunset State, Su Lu had seriously thought that if he was killed by the two killers from Bermuda, would the army god Li Pifu avenge him? After thinking about it for a while, he couldn't help but deduce that if he really died, the old man would definitely not make a move against the 7 great families because that would directly destroy the foundation of the Federation's existence. Looking at the silent Su Lu, Shi Qinghai knew that he had his own plans. He smiled and didn't say anything more. With the help of the alcohol that was gradually entering his brain, he gently swayed the small amount of liquor in the military water bottle and softly hummed a very familiar song. When he sang 27 cups of liquor to the 3rd cup, Su Li's voice softly followed and accompanied him all the way to the end, just like the countless nights in the bar in Linhai State. Shi Qinghai, who was habitually drunk, would be silent for a long time when he sang the last cup of liquor and thought of his father. Then he would drink a full cup of liquor as a memorial or cry to his heart's content. Su Lu knew the sad story that made Shi Qinghai resolutely join the anti-government army in Green Dragon Mountain, so he couldn't help but feel a little surprised when he found that he didn't end the song, but started from the beginning again. Shi Qinghai's slightly hoarse but charming voice started to repeat the line of the girl, like a needle skipping in a retro record, giving people a headache. The 6th cup of liquor, the stone path curved, there was a girl at the end. There was a girl at the end of the stone path. Girl, girl. That's my little girl. These are all my girls. I only want my girl. Su Lu keenly heard the small changes in the two's self-made lyrics. His eyes gradually narrowed as he stared at Shi Qinghai and said with a faint smile, "If it's a girl, is it Zhou Yu?" Shi Qinghai's drunken eyes were like stars. He raised his eyebrows and said, "So what? Before I went to the front line, I played the guqin for 3 days at the gate of the West Mountain compound to provoke her. When she came back from Linhai for a vacation, she gave me a handkerchief from inside the wall, wrapped in a stone. How deep is her love?" Su Lu was stunned. The picture of a playboy standing at the gate of the Federal Army compound and harassing a minister's daughter in an infuriating manner, instantly formed in his mind. He couldn't help but ask in surprise, "Are you serious?" "I'm warning you, Yuzi isn't as cold and arrogant as she looks. If she's really in love, she can be stubborn." "Yuzi?" Shi Qinghai frowned and said disdainfully, "I'm not Nan Mingxiu. She's my woman. She doesn't need your permission to find any kind of man." "You can't say that." Su Lu shrugged and said, "In a legal sense, I'm the father of her son. As a guardian, for the legal rights of the child, I have the right to object to her boyfriend." Shi Qinghai was stunned. He deeply exhaled a breath of alcohol and cursed. A moment later, a charming smile reappeared on his handsome face. He said, "In fact, I've been writing to her for the past year. In the beginning, she replied very little. She was basically like a beautiful shrew. Although she still replies very little now, she's like a beautiful gentle girl. They're actually having an affair behind my back. What a pair of adulterers. Sulu said solemnly, but his mood was exceptionally joyous. Back then, he had selfishly wanted to leave behind a descendant of young Master Shi, who he thought was bound to die. More importantly, he didn't want an innocent life to fall just like that. But now, it seemed that a fairy tale-like ending was about to happen. After living with Zhou Yu in the Wangdu apartment for so many days, he had long felt like a family member. He also hoped that she could have an excellent emotional home. If Shi Qinghai was no longer a playboy, he would naturally be the best man. How did you figure it out? He asked curiously. I don't want to thank you, but it's true that because of the stories you told me, I fell in love with such a straightforward and cold woman. The most important thing is that she's really beautiful. Shi Qinghai replied with a calm expression, when I was in high school, I liked astronomy and geography the most. I knew that the universe is long, but human life is short. So in the future, I didn't care much about men and women. I only liked to have fun, and I didn't like to make promises. But now, I understand that things like life and the universe can't be treated equally. Just like the magnificent Luling on this planet, she only appears once every 3,000 years. The next time she appears will be 371 years later. I won't be able to see her for the rest of my life. Since that's the case, I should see something that's relatively long and worth having. Su Li's thoughts suddenly floated. He said, astronomy and geography. Tai Ziyuan is also very interested in exploring the universe. In my opinion, you can become good friends with him. Shi Qinghai said, in my opinion, I'm very willing to let this prince die. While Mr. Shi was thinking about how rare it was to see Luling in the snowy night, on the battleship outside the planet's atmosphere, the resident program of the Federal Central Computer was performing relevant calculations. On planet 5460, deep in the rock tunnels, the detection devices that were spread all over the ground faithfully recorded all kinds of fluctuations and transmitted them back to the battleship. It was like a huge spider web, keenly sensing the movements around it and then determining the real situation. The geomagnetic storm suddenly became abnormal, and the rock mass became denser and denser. The Federal Central Computer was calculating, or in other words, calculating the changes that happened inside the planet. This required a lot of data and high-speed computing power. Even though it seemed to be omnipotent, it was still a bit difficult. Chapter 529. When Sulu woke up from his nightmare, he suddenly felt a wave of sadness in his heart. He sat on the edge of his bed in a daze. He didn't know if it was because he had gotten drunk with Shi Qinghai on a snowy night 10 days ago, but the reverse flow of digestive fluids from certain glands in his body was like the passionate yet hurtful friendship between men. It fiercely burned his stomach and the academic words on it. Or was it because Shang Qiu had completed the MXT test mission 3 days ago and was currently on her way back to the distant capital ring? But he still remembered many mornings and she wore small snow boots and stood in the thick snow like a playful wild cat. Every time she took a step, she would kick her legs back. It was an extremely cute scene. Because of this, his heart was vaguely troubled by this feeling. At this moment, the Federal Central Computer's request to contact him appeared in his mind. Ever since that night when he had requested for privacy, the old bastard had bitterly started his days of being neglected. Whenever he wanted to chat with him, he would have to knock on a door that didn't exist in the void. After accepting the request, Sulu looked at the clear and concise words in his left eye and the virtual three-dimensional image. Cold sweat instantly broke out on his back and dyed his green military vest as heavy as ink. Only now did he understand that the frightening scenes in his dream were actually real. The old bastard had called him through the back door. Before he could ask why the Federal Central Computer had entered his dream without his permission, Sulu hurriedly got up with a gloomy expression. He hastily put on a jacket and rushed out of the room. Braving the bitter cold, he ran to Shi Qinghai's door and kicked it open. He quickly said a few words and then rushed to the regimental headquarters. Without hesitation, he pressed the emergency button for the headquarters. In an instant, a sharp and piercing alarm pierced through the dark night and the faint snowflakes and spread throughout the entire military camp. Whether it was the soldiers of the 1st Regiment of the 17th Division or the soldiers of Green Dragon Mountain, they were all startled awake. Although they were extremely puzzled, no one dared to ask what had happened. They silently but quickly put on their uniforms and equipment and ran towards the snowy area in front of the headquarters. He put on his military cap and inserted the H-12 pistol into his holster. He looked at Su Lu and said, "Instructor, if this is just a drill, I think it will be difficult for us to explain to these guys who were woken up." In the past few days, the Federation's ground forces had been trying to destroy the last remnants of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. However, the Imperial soldiers relied on the desperation and craziness of death, and the Glacier Alley base that they had been operating for decades, and under the ruthless and even self-destructive command of General Ambly, they did not budge an inch. They used all means of combat, and even used the primitive and cruel tactic of using human bombs. The final battle was exceptionally bloody. In the 700 square meters of the Glacier War Zone, there were people dying every moment. The Federation forces, who had the absolute strategic advantage, were actually somewhat terrified under the frenzied attacks of the Imperial soldiers. Just 10 days ago, even Du Shaoqing had been forced to have the Iron 7th Division slow down the pace of clearing out the alleys. However, this had nothing to do with the 1st Regiment of the 17th Division and that Green Dragon Mountain unit that had no official designation. They had not entered the heart of the fierce battle all this time. Furthermore, to this day, even if the Imperial Expeditionary Force was a god, they would not be able to conjure any unit to break through the encirclement in front of them and kill their way into the camp. Therefore, the emergency call for tonight's emergency assembly made many people somewhat puzzled as to what had happened. Level 2 clearance, top secret. I'm very sorry, but I can't reveal anything to you. I believe the official order will come down soon. The emergency assembly is to let everyone prepare in advance. Su Li's ears were filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and the heavy mechanical sound of engineering mecha. After a moment of silence, he spoke seriously to He Lei. The emergency assembly order could only be issued by the highest-ranking officer of the army. Although his previous actions did not cross the line, they still severely violated military discipline. However, He Lei knew what kind of person he was. This was especially so when he saw that rare trace of solemnity on his face. His brain had already begun to turn quickly, on guard against the major event that was about to happen. Back in the day, when Su Lu had given up his glory and wealth to face the entire upper echelon of the Federation alone, he had not even blinked an eyelid. However, the news that the charter computer had given him tonight made him nervous and uneasy. Because this time, what they were about to face was the greatest and most heartless of all, the nature that had never changed its way of doing things because of human emotions. At the same time that the 1st Regiment of the 17th Division and the Green Dragon Mountain troops sounded the emergency assembly order, in the distant capital ring, Planet S1, at the end of a road that had been cut off halfway in the outskirts of a special zone, inside a building that was regarded as a holy place by the Federation citizens, a sharp alarm rang out at the same time. Cui Zhedong of the Bureau of Proclamation had just finished brewing his first cup of flower tea since work, but right now, he was not in the mood to taste the fragrance of the yellow chrysanthemum. He withdrew his finger that had activated the alarm and looked at the results of the calculations on the giant hologram. He could not help but shake his head, thinking to himself that it was truly a blessing to have the opportunity to see the most spectacular scene in the universe in this lifetime. It was just that he did not know if the Federation soldiers on that planet had the time to all evacuate. Right now, he could only hope that the old thing's calculation results were not too far off. The charter computer's alarm was immediately transmitted to the president's official residence. Sir Pabre, who was having breakfast with the First Lady, had a trace of doubt flash across his tanned face. He immediately asked Director Breen beside him, "Can our soldiers withdraw?" According to the results of past observations, it takes a very long time for the flow on Planet 5460 to activate. Just now, the Department of Defense has already made the decision to transfer all the Federal Fleet and the battle fleets of the 3320 and 163 star systems over there. In addition to the backup transport forces of the West Woods Administrative Main Planet, the withdrawal of the troops should not be a problem. The young Director Breen replied calmly, clearly, and accurately. After a short pause, he continued, "Now, what we need to consider is the time it will take for the ground troops to withdraw to the airborne base, and whether the remaining forces of the Imperial Expeditionary Force will stop at all costs to delay the retreat of the troops. Also, after all, this is the first time that the flow on Planet 5460 has appeared in advance since the Federation observed it 9 times, and this time, it is more than 300 years ahead of schedule. Later, the Federal Academy of Science will hold an academic discussion on this. That's not what I'm concerned about." President Pabre smiled at his nervous wife, turned his head, and said coldly, "I only care about the consequences. None of our soldiers can die in that damn ice water. Tell the Department of Defense, if the Empire really tries to delay the retreat of the troops, let the fleet use the main cannons to fire directly and drive all these Empire rabbits back into the ice cave." Director Breen was slightly stunned and subconsciously objected, but there is still plenty of time. Even if the Empire understands what is going on, they don't have a good way to stop our retreat. The effect of the main cannons of the battleships is not very good, and the energy consumption is too high. In fact, the Federation's interstellar energy quota this year has already exceeded by 70%. Being able to let those young men return with glory and safety is much more important than something like the energy quota. President Pabre said in a deep and firm voice, "Please make an appointment with Lady Tai for me. The government needs her help regarding the energy quota." In the building of the Department of Defense, Zhou Yingxing, wearing glasses, carefully read the report sent by the Bureau of Proclamation, listened to the President's instructions delivered by Secretary Jiao, and a slight smile flashed across his slightly tired face. He said, "According to Mr. President's opinion, immediately draft the retreat plan and let Commander Zhong make the decision. I believe that he will also like the best gift that nature has given to the Federation." In the headquarters building of the West Woods Main Planet Federation, Zhong Shouhu used 2 fingers to continuously rub his white eyebrows, looked at all the documents that had just been delivered to him, and was silent for a long time. In the end, a complicated smile appeared on his face. He was about to rush to the front line again and directly command the last wave of attack of the Federal forces. He had enough pride and confidence that the military operation would definitely succeed. However, the situation was different from the situation on Planet 3320 and 163. Planet 5460 had the least amount of Empire troops, but the enemy general named Ambly had forcefully fought the battle to this extent. Even if he personally took command, he didn't dare to lightly say that he would be able to save a few Federation soldiers from dying. This is really a big surprise. In the early hours of the morning, the 1st Regiment of the 17th Division indeed received an emergency order from the headquarters. This order was electronically signed by Deputy Commander Yi himself, and it required all the participating troops on the ground to immediately evacuate from the Arctic glaciers. All the troops had to cooperate with each other. On one hand, they had to maintain a sense of pressure on the Empire people, and on the other hand, they had to retreat to the predetermined location as quickly as possible. The words of the order were very cold and fierce, and no troops were allowed to raise any objections. Therefore, in a short 3 hours, the Federal forces, who were desperately searching for traces of the Empire people in the ice pit alleys during the night and during the day, and risking their lives to attack, quickly and without panic, all began to quickly and calmly leave the battle area, turning into countless black lines and returning south on the snowy plains. Su Li's 1st Regiment of the 17th Division and that lucky Green Dragon Mountain Troop, because of a certain back door, were the first to make preparations to retreat. Even before the command center's orders arrived, he had already forced He to give the order to have the mixed forces forcefully move 30 kilometers south. What exactly happened? He sat in the command vehicle with a complicated expression, looking at the details of the order on the hologram, completely puzzled. If the Federation was preparing to set up a new battle plan, then even if a high-ranking officer like him didn't know the strategic intentions, he would definitely have been blown by the wind and guessed some of the details. He definitely wouldn't have retreated in such a baffling manner like tonight. There were many officers and soldiers of the Federation who had the same question as him. The officers and soldiers of the various participating troops watched as the remnants of the Empire were suppressed to the point of death after paying the price of countless sacrifices and blood, and could collapse at any time. In the end, they were ordered by their superiors to urgently retreat south, away from the dawn of victory. It was truly somewhat difficult for them to accept. In order to prevent panic from spreading among the troops, the upper echelons of the Federation tightly controlled this news within an extremely small circle. Only less than 5 generals in the ground forces knew the inside story. Su Lu was the first to know of this matter in the Federation, and he understood and agreed with the actions of the headquarters. However, facing the puzzled gazes of the people around him, he felt a bit of pressure. Chapter 530. Without any warning, a high-latitude volcano on the shore of the Western Sea began to violently erupt. The glaciers that had accumulated for hundreds of millions of years began to melt at a speed visible to the naked eye. The ice and snow within a radius of several hundred square kilometers of the volcano, mixed with molten lava, began to spread toward low-lying areas. Wherever the molten lava passed, the originally barren snowy plains were smeared into a complete mess. The blazing red lava came into close contact with the cold ice, producing sizzling sounds of barbecuing. Water vapor, together with black ash, crazily sprayed into the sky. What followed was a strong earthquake as high as a magnitude 9. Fortunately, the source of the earthquake this time was extremely deep. After it spread to the surface, its intensity was greatly reduced. Moreover, on the surface of this planet that had been fighting for several decades, other than the military vehicles and mechas moving through the wilderness, there weren't too many man-made structures. Therefore, it didn't cause too many casualties. The arrival of the volcanic eruption and earthquake was only a kind warning issued by nature to the two sides that were busy fighting on this planet. The overall temperature of the northern hemisphere of 5,460 began to slowly rise. Under this shocking astronomical phenomenon, a total of 7 divisions of the Federation's ground forces retreated toward the south at high speed. Beside the icy peak of K-22, there was a small group of Empire troops stationed in an alley. They were the first to discover the enemy's unusual movements. They, who had long been accustomed to fighting day and night without rest, were shocked to discover that, in the past 4 hours, even though the Federation's artillery shells were still unceasingly bombarding them, those troublesome Federal forces never attacked again. The company commander thought silently for a long time. He used his hand to heavily pound the cold-resistant concrete wall of the fortification. Carrying his machine gun, he crawled out of the alley. The mud mixed with the damaged military uniform, sticking to his body and making him feel that something was a bit strange. The silence around the battlefield was a bit frightening. With difficulty, he climbed through the thick ice used to block the Federation's bullets at the entrance of the alley. The company commander used his gun to support himself on the ground and stood up. He looked at the incomparably empty snowy plains in front of him and the silent Federation's military camp on the other side. He was so shocked that he didn't know what to say. The Federation retreated? Squeezed by the desperation of the fierce battles and abandonment in the past few days, he was silent for a long time before he finally confirmed the fact. He grabbed a handful of snow and rubbed his face that was full of mud. It was not until the roots of his dark beard were almost bleeding that he finally woke up from the cold. Ecstatically, he turned around and ran into the alley, roaring in a hoarse voice, "The soldiers of the Federation have retreated. The Federation has retreated. The soldiers of the Imperium deep inside the fortification were stunned. They looked at each other in disbelief for a long time before they finally believed what their captain said. Helping each other to stand up, they laughed and cried to their heart's content, bashed each other, and hugged each other. The lucky celebration of escaping death in the alley did not last long. The people's laughter gradually died down because they could faintly hear a strange sound that they had never heard before. It was coming from the deepest part of the alley. That captain tilted his head and listened for a moment. Suddenly, his expression changed drastically. Grabbing the gun beside him, he rushed towards the side door of the underground alley and shouted loudly, "Prepare for battle." Rumbling sounds came faintly from the depths of the alley. They were extremely heavy and powerful. At first, they were very far away and were not clear, but in a short amount of time, they became as loud and clear as war drums. The soldiers of the Empire lay on the ground, staring nervously and savagely at the entrance of the dark alley. They didn't know what these terrifying sounds were, and subconsciously thought that they were the new mecha weapons of the Federation. Only heavy alloy equipment could make such loud noises. This seemed to be the only explanation for the sudden retreat of the Federation army on the other side of the glacier. What came was not the Federation's new mecha that could enter the depths of the glacier, but an existence even more terrifying than the mecha horde. The Imperial captain guarding at the very front heard the thunderous sounds. His pupils constricted. Relying on a sliver of dim light, after seeing what it was, his body began to tremble violently from fear. However, he did not have time to turn around, nor did he have time to shout before he was smashed into the wall, becoming a mangled corpse. Tens of thousands of tons of cold water, carrying heavy and sharp icicles, gathered at the top of the glacier and at the cracks. Following the underground channels created by nature, they rampaged through the interior of the glacier at an extremely fast speed. Then, they finally entered the underground tunnel network that the Imperium had built for decades. Under the tremendous pressure, they turned into an unstoppable torrent of icicles and gushed out. With a loud boom, Ling Lu instantly charged into the alley of the Empire's army. He roared and slammed into the hard concrete wall, releasing thunderous booms. Then, he ran out without the slightest fear, turning into a fountain on the precipice of the glacier, shooting into the blue sky amidst the morning light. Only after reaching a height of several dozen meters did he reluctantly fall back down. In an extremely short amount of time, the torrent of water destroyed all the attacks in the alley. As for the Imperial soldiers, they did not even know where they were. Not even a trace of blood could be seen in the alley. A few minutes later, the pressure in the cracks of the glacier gradually stabilized, and the torrent calmed down. The collapsed alley was filled with cold water. It was a deep blue like a bottomless lake. Dense icicles and occasionally a few broken empty boxes floated on top of it. The temperature was still not high. Not long after, the tens of thousands of tons of cold water in the alley slowly condensed into ice again. After a few days, when the temperature was higher, the ice would melt again, roar again, and maybe condense again. This process would repeat countless times. Maybe they would find an opportunity to rush into the grassland neighbors that they had not seen in the south for more than 2,000 years. The dark alley was dead silent. Occasionally, the sound of water rippling and cracking could be heard. The place where the Federal forces were fighting a bloody battle, the last base of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, under the power of nature, turned into a land of death. A few small bases that were hidden in the glacier in Area K were all destroyed by the torrent of water. Old General Ambridge had already received this unfortunate news. With the help of his guards, he slowly walked out of the gate of the base. Looking at the sky in the east, he saw the clear line of black smoke from the volcano. A complicated expression flashed across his old face. If it was only a small torrent of water caused by a volcanic eruption and an earthquake, it shouldn't have spread to the last base under his feet, the old general thought silently. However, his heart was cold. He knew that this was just a way to comfort himself. If it was only a small torrent of water caused by a volcanic eruption, why did the Federation retreat? The Empire did not have enough cutting-edge computers to conduct research in this area, but the Federation did. Mobilize the rest of the troops. Use the last of the military equipment reserves. No matter the cost, we must delay the Federal Army that is retreating to the south. Don't try to stop their combat troops. Target their quick-condensing cement warehouse and engineering meccas. Old General Ambridge looked to the south and said in a cold tone, "Remember, no matter the cost, no matter the rank of the officer, you must at least keep one soldier of the Federation for me." "Yes, General," the guard beside him replied. General Ambridge narrowed his eyes and looked at the white snow in front of him. The wrinkles on his face were like layers of snow that had been blown by the wind. After a long silence, he added, "I know that you are not afraid of death, but this time, you can't be afraid of death, because this may be the last time we are not afraid of death. I will accompany you." In the glacier area of the planet, it was still late at night. In some places, it was already early morning. The last soldiers of the Imperial Expeditionary Force on this planet walked out or crawled out of the narrow alleys. These exhausted soldiers who had almost run out of supplies and equipment didn't even have the time to breathe the fresh air that they hadn't been in contact with for a long time. They glanced at the blue sky that they hadn't seen for many days, and their eyes were filled with faint emotions as if they were about to die. They silently and valiantly bent their bodies, supported their companions, and ran to the strategic nodes in all directions. The nearly 10,000 soldiers of the Empire didn't know what was happening on this planet. They didn't even know that there was a volcano erupting in Area K. The violent tremor 2 days ago was a huge earthquake in the distance. They only knew that this was an order from their superiors, and that this was their last chance to be loyal to His Majesty. Therefore, they took their guns and walked out. In broad daylight on the flat snowy plains, they went to intercept or chase the Federal Army that was 10 times their number. What kind of madness was this? The volcanic ash in the distant sky was blown away by the cold wind. In the eastern sky of the morning, outside the planet's atmosphere that was so clear that it seemed unreal, a black line could be faintly seen. That was the Federal fleet in outer space. At the entrance of the Empire's base high in the Sea of Ice, General Ambley, who was standing in the wind and snow to send off the soldiers, was suddenly pushed down by his guards and then forcibly dragged into the sturdy base. More than 60 milky white beams of light shot out from the warships in space and instantly entered the clear and sparse atmosphere. With the help of the charter network's precise positioning, they fiercely fell in all directions on the snowy plains. There weren't any loud noises. The light beams that were adjusted to cover the area of the attack turned countless Empire soldiers who were arduously advancing into light smoke. Countless ice and snow melted, and snowy peaks collapsed and no longer existed. The entire process was like an accelerated spring, but it was even more terrifying. Just this round of attacks from the main cannons of the battleships had already destroyed 2 years of the Federation's peacetime energy quota. However, the Empire soldiers who were shouting in vain to avoid or even cursed at the sky discovered in despair that dozens of milky white beams of light blasted down from the sky above. In the face of the madness of the Empire, the Federation's response was also very crazy. The 7 divisions of the Federation's ground forces, under the protection of the fleet regardless of the cost, sped up their retreat to the south. After seeing those milky white beams of light, the suspicion and anger that had been heating up in the military camp immediately vanished like smoke in thin air. The soldiers still didn't know the real reason for the sudden retreat, but when they saw the Federation actually use so much of the crystal mine's energy quota to launch a group space attack that hadn't been seen in many years, they knew very well that the situation was definitely tense to a certain extent. 3 days later, the great retreat organized by the Federation's entire force finally succeeded. All of the ground forces withdrew to the 4 military spaceports in the southern hemisphere and were then urgently conscripted by the government to be carried back into space by countless military and civilian spaceships. Only a few special forces and researchers remained on the surface. They were responsible for monitoring everything that happened on this planet and silently observing the Imperial Expeditionary Force's demise. Sulu also stayed behind. Chapter 531. About 400 soldiers from the new 17th Division and the Iron 7th Division stayed behind. Together with the researchers, they were stationed at the newly built Shinza spaceport. This spaceport was located on a large granite base. The sea level was quite high, and there was the Huangshanling Lonely Ridge in front of it as a shield, so they didn't have to worry too much about the terrifying flow of water. The Federation had determined that this was a safe area based on past research records, so they chose this place as an observation point. However, they still cautiously sent 3 types of light battleships to stand by on the tarmac. If the planet's environment was unimaginably bad and even affected this place, they had to be able to immediately evacuate these few hundred soldiers. The volcanic eruptions on the planet became more and more frequent. Earthquakes of various sizes never stopped like the music of the new year. Countless tsunamis were born, collided, destroyed, and reborn in the ocean, causing the blue seawater to become turbid. Some areas where sulfur was concentrated were even bleeding bright red. Because of the geomagnetic shift, the geomagnetic storms at the 2 poles became more and more intense. Other than the optical images from the high-altitude satellites, there weren't many other ways to monitor the few remaining Imperial armies in the Northern Hemisphere. Sulu and the Federation officers who stayed behind to guard the spaceport calmly carried out their work, waiting for the long flow of water to end, waiting for the peace after 3 months. 74 standard hours later, the underground flow between the glaciers in the Northern Hemisphere became more and more magnificent due to the rising temperature. Countless streams of cold water penetrated through the hard ice layer and converged at a high speed. They shot out of the surface of the glaciers and into the sky, shooting countless beautiful and cold waterfalls. Then, the flood mixed with ice fell heavily, instantly overflowing the obstacles in front of it, and slowly but firmly surged towards the low-lying areas in the south. 3 days later, the first flow of water in Area K crossed the central region of the snowfield and poured into a snow valley, rushing into the primitive forest in the valley. In front of the flow of water that was dozens of kilometers wide, thick ancient trees that were more than 1,000 years old fell like paper. The green vegetation was instantly torn into pieces. The mixture of ice and water all over the mountains and plains had a semi-solidified gelatinous feeling. Because it was wrapped in the black sand under the snow, it looked gray and dull. In the cold snow water, there were countless sharp and heavy icicles mixed in, like a knife without a sharp edge. In front of this giant blunt knife of the Creator, nothing could resist at all. The whole earth seemed to have been ruthlessly scraped. Wherever it passed, not a single blade of grass grew. Giant trees fell, birds and beasts wailed, and then there was dead silence. The further south they went, the more the ice melted, and the lower the terrain became. The speed of the mighty Lioli invasion also became faster and faster. The Lioli front, which stretched for hundreds of kilometers, rushed all the way to the south. If it encountered a mountain, it would be blocked, and if it encountered a lake, it would spread and freeze, and if it encountered a lake, it would drive the lake away. In the 3rd millennium, this lonely planet at the edge of the West Woods would automatically tilt its angle in a strange way. In this big movement that changed the sky and the earth, countless small earthquakes and volcanic eruptions would occur on the surface of the planet that was divided by ice and green. In the glacier area of 1/3 of the Northern Hemisphere, the most spectacular Lioli phenomenon would occur. Just like at this moment, the Lioli scene was so spectacular that it made people feel a sense of awe and fear towards nature. And this was only the first wave of this Lioli. With the help of the research of the previous generation of scientists and the support of the supercomputing power of the charter computer, the Federation was confident that they could leave humans on the surface of the planet for observation. However, those who stayed behind could not help but feel frightened when they saw such an irresistible natural scene. Any big astronomical phenomenon would inevitably occur on a long scale. Even if a giant black hole swallowed a super-large galaxy, it would not be able to eat it in one bite. The soldiers of the Federation who stayed behind on the surface of the planet had to wait silently and nervously for 3 months. They were shocked by what they saw in front of them, but the emotions in the depths of their hearts were extremely complicated. The Federation paid a great price. Countless comrades sacrificed themselves to force the Imperial Expeditionary Force into a desperate situation. However, just when the enemy was sure to lose, and they were about to win the glorious moment of glory, God came out to mess with them. Although the Lioli would definitely destroy the remnants of the Imperial Expeditionary Force trapped in the glacier, and victory was still there, this feeling was not very good. Su definitely did not have this kind of emotion. He calmly completed his work in the engineering room and recorded everything that the optical lens captured. The Federal forces could be wiped out without a single person dying. This kind of victory was what he liked the most. Through the Federal Central Computer, he confirmed that there was not much crustal movement at the site of the massacre that was discovered a few days ago. After the war, he should be able to find it again under the thick layer of ice. Only then did he feel relieved. On the wide light screen, in the images captured by the satellite, some high-definition shots could sometimes be captured. In the Lioli that was mixed with mud, rocks, and countless strange-shaped ice blocks, there were occasionally some thin corpses of the Imperial soldiers that were not wearing clothes that covered their bodies. Most of the corpses that were discovered had already been rubbed by the ice blocks and rocks until they were too horrible to look at. It was chilling to look at. Su Lu, who was extremely sympathetic, looked at the images on the light screen. He did not have the slightest bit of sympathy or emotion in his heart. His expression was calm. Professor Shen had taught him that there was no such thing as reason in this universe. His experience over the years had also convinced him that God had never taken the initiative to punish any evil deeds. However, this time, the Lioli suddenly appeared more than 300 years ahead of time, which made him feel touched. People often said that God was not fair. Now, God was finally fair for once. This was the retribution of the Imperial Expeditionary Force that slaughtered the Federation civilians. Su Lu thought as he walked out of the room. He raised his head and looked at the gray sky that was mixed with strange lightning. He looked at the snowflakes that had just drifted down and narrowed his eyes. Because of the melting of the glaciers, billions of tons of Lioli carried countless ice blocks, boulders, trees, and even heavy mecha wreckage towards the south. At the same time, it also brought with it cold and relatively humid temperatures. In this season, it was definitely not supposed to snow at Xinqiu Airport, but it was actually snowing. I've never seen snow in Donglin. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the fluffy snowflakes that were fluttering in the air. He noticed that the snowflakes were a little gray because of the volcanic ash. After a pause, he continued, "That's why every time I see clean snow, I always feel very happy. I just suddenly thought that if it were to snow in Donglin, it would definitely be this kind of gray snow. You don't know how much dust there is in Donglin. I've always been curious. Boss, you're obviously from Shanglin. You've only been a soldier in Donglin for 2 years, but no matter how I look at it, you seem more like a person from Donglin." Bai Yulan held the cigarette between 2 fingers and took a deep breath. She looked past the fluttering strands of hair and asked softly, "Could it be that those famous stone miners really have such a great influence on people's behavior?" Su Lu did not answer. He just looked at the snowflakes in the sky and spaced out. The people in his hometown had never seen real snow. The cafe owner on Zhonglo Street had never seen real snow. The beautiful policewoman with long legs in boots had never seen real snow. His long-dead parents had never seen real snow. Oh, and his sister, Xian Yi, had never seen real snow either. Not being able to talk about his feelings for his parents, his sister, his hometown, and his childhood made him forget about it. This was the most difficult thing for Su Lu to accept in his life as a fugitive. Bai Yulan, who was squatting on the ground, looked up and saw a rare look of reminiscence on Su Li's face. After a moment of silence, she said softly, Bai Ziming has always liked to capture these kinds of scenes. If he were here right now, he would definitely be very excited. The documentary, Team 7, had already finished filming. The producer, director, guest reporter, and narrator, Bai Ziming had already left and returned to the Golden Star Film Studio in the capital of S1. Only after hearing Bai Yulan's words did Su Lu recall this matter. Now that the production duo was no longer by his side, he actually felt a little uneasy. Although it was a spectacular sight, it would still be boring if one watched it too much. This was especially so if one watched it with a nervous and fearful heart. For a strong-willed professional soldier, this was a huge torture. Only the real scholars and researchers were extremely excited. They were screaming in the observation room. It was important to know that not all scholars had the opportunity to see such a rare sight that only happened once every 3,000 years. This was a temperament unique to the real academic community. Su Lu actually had a lot in common with these researchers. However, in the boring waiting time, he could not observe and record for a long time like them. This was because he was the deputy division leader of the new 17th Division, so he had to organize the study of the officers who stayed behind. Whether it was the new 17th Division or the Iron 7th Division, whether it was the troops who stayed behind on the ground or the fleet in space, at this moment, all the commanders gathered together seriously and checked the battle reports of the other two fallen stars on time every day. They were watching the command of a real military genius. In the eyes of the people, Zhong Suahu of the West Woods was a gloomy and violent dictator. He was the head of the 7 major families, a big shot who spanned both the military and the political world, and a big shot who ruled a corner of the empire. The officers and the people admired his hard work in leading the West Woods and the rotational warfare troops to fight against the Imperial Expeditionary Force for more than 10 years. However, they did not have a specific evaluation of his military command. This was completely different from Division Commander Shaoqing. Because of some rumors, the people had always doubted the ability of the Federation's frontline commander-in-chief. These disregard and doubts instantly stopped when the Tiger of the West Woods went to the front line again and personally commanded the victory of the military operation. In the 163 and 3,320 systems, facing the most powerful force of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, this tiger suddenly burst out with all his brilliance. The large army gathered by the Federation turned into an invincible iron stream under his command. He vividly displayed his amazing combat ability and announced to the entire universe that he was the most talented military genius with one shocking and ingenious tactics and meticulous strategic concepts after another. Who could have thought that the 3 divisions were the secret moves that Commander Zhong had prepared in advance? Who could have thought of it? I analyzed the battle report after the fact and still could not understand how he had arranged all this. How could those poor commanders of the Empire have guessed it in advance? Yu Qinghai, the commander of the new 17th Division on the light beam, could not hide his surprise. He said, "This battle was so fierce that it made people speechless. After this battle, who dares to question his military talent and think that he is not qualified to be the frontline commander-in-chief?" Having followed the Federation's god of war for many years, he actually used the word, military talent, to describe Zhong Suahu's commanding ability without any taboo. Naturally, he admired this man to the extreme. Su Lu suppressed the shock in his heart. Thinking of the conversation between himself and Commander Zhong that night, he could not help but think in a mocking tone, he didn't fight seriously before, but now he is. Chapter 532. The days of waiting for Lu Ling's arrival or departure felt extremely long to the people. The surface of the planet shook continuously. Countless streams of boiling magma cheered as they rushed toward the long-lost ground. Countless streams of melted snow cheered as they rushed toward the long-lost south. The 3 largest plains had turned into an ocean, but it was snowing during summer in the southern hemisphere's hilly region. The gloomy clouds that covered thousands of kilometers of the sky were swept up by the strong wind and rolled into strange shapes. Dense and huge lightning flashed continuously in the clouds, tearing the gloomy, wet, and cold sky apart. Then, thunder rumbled, causing the entire earth to begin to tremble. In this hellish environment, the only thing that could make the Federation soldiers feel a little bit of sunshine was the good news that came from the battlefields of the other two galaxies. Of course, as for the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, it was not known to outsiders how complicated their feelings were. Like the commander of the new 17th Division, Yu Qinghai, all the soldiers who watched the final battle of the Federation's victorious military operation were in awe of the military talent displayed by Tiger of the West Woods in this battle. All the officers automatically gathered in one place to discuss the details of the battle. They analyzed Commander Zhong's commanding methods in depth and learned seriously. Even the officers of the Iron 7th Division who stayed on the surface were involved in the process of learning from student Zhong Laohu. It was said that this was a direct instruction from the commander they admired the most. In an inconspicuous grayish-black feather warship in the fleet of the Federation outside the atmosphere, Du Shaoqing, who was sitting upright in his chair, was reading the battle reports sent by the two galaxies with a serious expression. With his rank, the battle reports that he could read were much more detailed than the basic officers. Therefore, he could read them more clearly, and his feelings were even more complicated. So you haven't regressed in the past 10 years. Du Shaoqing took off the black lambskin gloves in his hand and tapped lightly on the light screen with his fingers. He raised his eyebrows as if he was thinking and looking forward to something. A confident smile appeared on his lips. Commander, is there anything to be happy about? Dong Fangpei, who was standing in the corner of the room, asked curiously. The federal forces knew that Commander Shaoqing had a pair of extremely loyal subordinates. They were Shiman Jin, the commander of the defense battalion, and Dong Fangpei, the commander of the assault regiment. Now, Shiman Jin had been transferred away from the front lines in advance for some reason and returned to the capital ring, while Dong Fangpei had been stripped of his military position because of the ambush of the Green Dragon Mountain troops. The Tiger commander in the frontline command center naturally wouldn't use these trivial matters to attack Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division. The 5460 command center also didn't want to offend the president and the military. Moreover, Dong Fangpei's refusal to rescue the advance group of Green Dragon Mountain seemed to be cold-blooded and heartless, but when they looked into the details, they couldn't find any violation of military orders. It was Du Shaoqing himself who removed Dong Fangpei from the position of lieutenant colonel. He didn't make such a severe punishment because he was arrogant and confident and wanted to use this opportunity to appease certain parties, nor did he want to punish Dong Fangpei for not helping when he was in danger. Instead, he wanted to punish him for his stupidity in commanding at the last minute. At the same time, he wanted to punish his subordinates for their dangerous impulsiveness due to their fanaticism when it came to him. Being demoted from a lieutenant colonel to a lieutenant colonel orderly might be extremely humiliating in the eyes of others, but Dong Fangpei didn't have such a concept at all. He was very happy to be able to follow beside his commander again like he did 10 years ago. The Iron 7th Division was made up of such a group of people. They were very cold, tough, and good at fighting. They were very strict with their enemies and their comrades. No one could find any fault with them in terms of military discipline and fighting spirit. That was why they were able to become the Federation's trump card division, and become the division with the highest status in the hearts of the Federation people after the 17th Division. However, on the surface of this planet and in space, there was a new 17th Division beside the Iron 7th Division, a new division that inherited the glorious history of the Army God Division. Since they entered the front line, they began to shine brightly and won many battles. If it was in the past, the 17th Division, which had Old Master Li Pifu and had sent countless stars to the Federation, would never put the Iron 7th Division in their eyes. They wouldn't even bother to fight with each other. However, because of the appearance of that person called Du Shaoqing, the two trump cards began to be on equal footing. Because of their similar statuses, those old historical grudges would find a suitable stage to play out again. On the ground, the friction between the two armies had never stopped. Fighting for military merits, which seemed childish but was the most important activity in the military camp, had always been happening. The hundreds of soldiers who stayed on the planet's surface to observe Luling were all from these two divisions. Now that they were trapped in a corner of the spaceport, the two sides often saw each other. They even had to eat in the same cafeteria. The provocation and disdain in their eyes shot at each other thousands of times, and the insults in their words never stopped. The anger between the two sides grew bigger and bigger, and there was a danger that it could explode at any time. One day, at noon, the freezing rain outside hit the window heavily, making people feel very upset. The soldiers of the new 17th Division and the Iron 7th Division began to mock each other in the cafeteria again. The content of this script would always repeat between the following lines: when my division went deep into the Empire's territory to destroy the enemy's 17th Division, you guys were still playing with mud in S3. When my division was fresh and stormed into the West Woods, you guys were still flirting with girls in Harbor City and could only eat my leftovers. My division's battle record, my division's killing of the enemy. My division fired the first shot of the Federation's counterattack against the Empire at the front line of Huangshanling Lonely Ridge. If my division's Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu didn't help, would you guys be able to fire that shot? Since Su Lu was mentioned, the following argument naturally developed into, my division has a level 5 ace pilot. My division has Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. My division has many of the latest MX mechas. My division has Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. My division beat your division in the military drill and graduation drill more than 10 years ago. My division only sent Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu alone to break through your defense camp. My division has the undefeated division commander Xiaoqing. My division has Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. My division commander Xiaoqing has never lost a battle and is known as the #1 general in the Federation. My division's Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu has never commanded. He blocked in front of your division commander by himself, and he didn't dare to do anything. The new 17th Division had a lot of things to show off, but the wonderful thing was that the soldiers knew very well that the most hated and most difficult part of the Iron 7th Division was Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. So no matter what the Iron 7th Division soldiers said, the new 17th Division would only say the words, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, with a mocking smile. These words were like an omnipotent patch that could be patched to any place they wanted. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division were enraged and their veins were bulging. Under the deliberate connivance of Division Commander Yu Qinghai, and the influence of Sour Lan Xiaolong and Dirty Work 7th Division, the new 17th Division was gradually inheriting the true and secretive style of the old 17th Division, shamelessness. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division had always considered themselves to be standard soldiers, abiding by military discipline, and were exemplary. When faced with such opponents, no matter how fierce they were in battle, they would never be able to win a battle of words. Probably because they had been ridiculed to the point of speechlessness too many times, today, the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division finally exploded. Since we're not your match, then let's fight. In the spacious cafeteria, hundreds of soldiers shouted furiously, picked up the tables and chairs beside them, and rushed towards the new 17th Division. At this moment, no one would care where the strict military discipline that their division commander Duoqing had strictly instructed them to go. The cafeteria was in chaos. Countless Federation soldiers were bleeding from their heads, and the air was filled with profanities. The sound of cursing the ancestors and cursing the female family members of the other side rose and fell one after another, reflecting each other. The broken cheap plastic tables and chairs and torn military uniforms accurately marked this chaotic scene. In the middle of the intense battle, the loudspeaker in the corner of the cafeteria suddenly rang. Hearing the sound from the loudspeaker, both sides were stunned and slowly stopped fighting. They subconsciously threw away the tables and chairs or chopsticks in their hands and stared blankly at the loudspeaker. The loudspeaker was not Du Xiaoqing's cold and angry rebuke, nor was it Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's sincere invitation from the sleeping lieutenant colonel. Instead, It was the latest battle report from the spaceship. The Federal forces have recovered the 3320 and 163 star systems in the entire territory. Commander Zhong has now entered the last base of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, the command room. In 3 minutes, the 3 regions of the Federation will simultaneously broadcast President Pabre's speech on TV. All troops should gather immediately and organize to watch. The soldiers in the cafeteria clenched their fists tightly. Their eyebrows were either relaxed, furrowed, or trembling. Their expressions were extremely complicated. It seemed like they wanted to laugh, but also seemed like they couldn't. This war had been going on for decades. The last military action was so tragic, but it ended just like that. The people of the Empire were kicked out of the Federation just like that. In the future, the children would ask their father, "What were you doing at that time? Are you going to say that you were beating up a detestable fellow officer?" The Federation's victory came so suddenly that not many people were mentally prepared. The people in the cafeteria were frozen for a long time before they woke up. The cheers replaced the curses, and the military caps that were constantly thrown into the air replaced the chairs and tables. All the soldiers excitedly clenched their fists and shouted, hugging the first person they could find and patting each other on the back. After a long period of cheering, the soldiers finally calmed down. They were shocked to find that the person they were hugging might be the person who was fighting with their lives just now. Their expressions changed drastically, and they turned around to go back to their own barracks to find wine to celebrate. They didn't look back at the other party again. Old General Ambly stood at the entrance of the heavily damaged fortification, calmly looking at the setting sun in the distance. Around him were traces of Liulin's rampage. The thick glacier was actually cut open, revealing the black rocks underneath. In the past few days, countless Liulin had poured into the underground fortification that the Empire had built for many years, completely destroying the last of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's strength. Then, the black and white mixed into the gray sky, making it impossible to tell the difference between the earth, rocks, blood, and corpses. This old general of the Empire was too unlucky, which was why his troops encountered Liulin. His luck was good, which was why the fortification that had been stopped for so long was actually preserved. However, in reality, it was even more painful for him to be alive, because he saw with his own eyes the mutilated corpses of countless young people from the Empire. The military cap on his head was long gone, and the general's uniform on his body was full of small holes. The old man looked at the red setting sun and narrowed his eyes. The wrinkles on his face reflected the red light, like a pile of burning paper. Chapter 533. No. General. Outside the black cave on the icy peak under the setting sun, the guard who had been following General Ambly for the past few days shouted in horror. He wanted to take the gun away from General Ambly's hand, but his ribs had been broken a few days ago, and even crawling was difficult for him. He could only reach out his hand in vain, trying to grab something. Ambly's arm froze, and he slowly lowered his head. His white hair was so dazzling under the red sun. After a long period of silence, he turned around and smiled at his loyal subordinate. There was a hint of consolation in his smile. If this was just a tragic war drama, the general who lost would have suddenly realized that he should cherish his life and live on bravely. He would have endured for many years, and then lead a new army to launch a bloody revenge against the enemy. However, this was a real battlefield, not a drama. The Imperial Expeditionary Army had been annihilated, and General Ambry was just like his subordinates. They wandered around aimlessly, unable to find their way home. They would never surrender, and only despair awaited them. There would never be a continuation of the plot. A crisp gunshot rang out, and a bloody hole appeared between the guard's eyebrows, and he fell to the ground. General Ambly, whose cheeks were sunken, stared blankly at the smoke coming out of the muzzle, and a self-deprecating expression flashed across his face. The former emperor loved this kind of antique gun the most, and General Ambly, who was in his prime, got one because of his military exploits. At that time, he mocked himself and asked himself if this antique gun could kill people. If it could kill people, then this antique gun could at least kill old people. Under the blood-red setting sun, Ambly, the highest commander of the Imperial Expeditionary Force on planet 5460, began to carefully tidy up his appearance. He took out half of a bone comb from his pocket, combed his white hair neatly, and then raised the gun to his forehead and pulled the trigger. After the gunshot, the old general's body suddenly collapsed. His senseless old and thin body fell forward and rolled down the dangerous black cliff. Along the way, he brought up some gravel, some snowflakes, and some dust before stopping. His head of white hair was already stained with blood and tangled into a ball. Sulu, who had worked with the experts for 3 days and 3 nights, fell asleep. In his sleep, he could faintly hear the cheers coming from the canteen in the distance. A smile appeared on his honest and sincere face. He probably thought that he was dreaming about victory, but he still did not wake up. When he woke up late at night, he was somewhat surprised to find that the entire military camp was brightly lit and filled with cheers. The air was filled with the smell of barbecue and alcohol. Soldiers were lying on the ground drunk, forgetting about the freezing rain. He even saw a few old professors, who were usually serious, dancing the hip dance that was popular in the capital ring. What happened? Bewildered, he responded to the warm greetings from all directions, the cups full of beer, and the strong palms. It was only after a long time that he realized what had made the soldiers on the ground, who were about to go crazy from boredom, so excited. Victory! Sulu responded to everything around him a little numbly, but for some reason, he was unexpectedly calm. In the atmosphere of the wild celebration, he silently took a bottle of hard liquor, quietly walked through the crowd, and came to a small hill on the side of the spaceport. The clouds in the sky were still thick, and the freezing rain was still falling. His body was a little hot, but he did not feel cold. He did not know if it was because of the alcohol or something else. Almost half of the 3.5-liter bottle of amber liquor had already been poured into his stomach. His face was slightly flushed as he looked down at what should have been a grassland at the bottom of the hill but was now a mud lake. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Did we win?" "Yes." The charter computer flashed in his left pupil. "So many people died in the war. I never thought that I would be able to hear the news of victory just by sleeping." Sulu scratched his head, and a silly smile appeared on his calm face. Sulu did not feel the slightest sense of loss for the final miserable fate of the Imperial Expeditionary Army. Instead, he accepted the fact with incomparable joy. Professional soldiers might have some kind of respect for their enemies, but that was only because the enemies were worthy of respect. But an army like the Imperial Expeditionary Force that slaughtered civilians would never find any positive comments from him. It was just like how Macklin had stolen the name of ideals for his own purposes. He had made countless young people who had no martial arts skills but only a strong desire to change social injustice serve as cannon fodder. That was something that he could not tolerate. What he was ashamed of was the innocent being harmed. It was a positive term that was used as a pass for evil. Sitting in the cold meadow on the hill, Sulu kept drinking hard liquor and looked at the flowing water under his feet. Thinking that the Federation had finally won, he could not help but frown and shake his head. Then, he laughed foolishly again. That night, he laughed foolishly more than he had in his entire life. The TV camera was interviewing Jian Shuier, the national girl who rarely showed her face after returning from the front line. The producer, Bai Ziming, did not draw a picture. He still used his voiceover that was familiar to the people of the Federation to ask, according to the information that has just been declassified, during the victory concert, Nutshell Group 7 was responsible for your security. Now, they have become a group of heroes in the eyes of the people of the Federation. Then, in your eyes, what kind of army do you think they are? Jian Shuier, who was sitting on a circular sofa, wore a simple sportswear and a sports cap that covered all her hair. She did not seem to have expected such a broad question. She frowned and thought for a long time. In her mind, the lazy and rascally appearance of the members of Group 7 appeared. She could not help but laugh. Then, she said seriously, "I think they are the most adorable army in the Federation." The scene changed. It was still the same question. "What kind of army do you think they are?" Behind an office desk carved from agarwood, the president of Nutshell Group smiled and said, "They are the pride of Nutshell. They are the most outstanding young people in the Federation." The same question was repeated in the TV camera. There were all kinds of people who answered the question. There were generals of the Ministry of Defense, and there were also respected members of the parliament. The target of the question was expanded to the people of all social classes in the Federation. Everyone's answer was different, but it had a different meaning. Since they can take over the flag of the 17th Division, it must mean that they are outstanding. As for the question of iron, I think it should be said that they are the trump card of the Federation. The person who answered this question was a young and proud officer of the 2nd Military Region. "I don't know much about war." A female employee who was wiping the dust on her high heels was stopped by the camera crew. She stood up in a panic. Suddenly, a trace of shyness flashed across her face. "But I have seen the TV. There are a lot of handsome young men in this army. Especially Secretary Bai, he is very pitiful." Chapter 534. After a quick zoom on the TV screen, Xiong Lingquan's big face full of mud appeared. He was eating and staring at the camera in shock and said, "Why are we fighting?" "Of course, it's to protect the Federation." Then he seemed to be honest, but he shamelessly admitted, "But this is the answer you taught me to say." Miraculously, neither the Golden Star Film Studio nor the Federal News Channel cut out this part of the footage. The camera continued to film for a long time, from the big tree behind the camp to the entrance of the division headquarters. Gu Shifeng, who had been appointed as the new commander of the Electric Control Battalion of the 17th Division, answered the question innocently, "Why did you fight?" "I say, Director, who came up with this stupid question?" "Because the veterans are charging too fiercely. If we don't keep up during the battle, it will be very embarrassing." The muscular Yan Bingyan thought for a moment and answered seriously with a thick cigarette in his mouth. "I really didn't think about this question. At the very beginning, we were sent to the West Woods for no reason. We were miserably drilled for 10 days before being thrown to the front line." Song Xiang frowned and thought of his friend who had left the army. He shook his head and said with a sigh, "In a place like this, if you don't fight, you will die. Naturally, we can only continue to fight." At the end of the interview in the documentary, Major Lan Xiaolong, who claimed to be the spokesperson for Group 7 and the new 17th Division, gave a concluding answer to the hundreds of millions of people of the Federation behind the camera. He was wearing a new military uniform with all the medals hanging on it. His answer quickly spread throughout the Federation society along with the broadcast of the documentary. It made countless young male citizens excited and hot-blooded. It was to the extent that this line was used on the recruitment posters of new recruits half a year later. As for Major Lan Xiaolong, who said this line, it became the model for the best male Federation actors to learn how to act cool. "Why are we fighting?" Major Lan Xiaolong's expression was firm. His dark eyebrows were like swords. His gaze was deep and distant. He answered word by word, "Because the enemy is there." The TV screen gradually turned dark, and a paragraph of words written by General Miles, the chairman of the Joint Staff Committee of the Federation of Defense, appeared on the screen. This paragraph of words must have come from the publicity draft drafted by the presidential residence and the civil officials of the Ministry of Defense. It was very appropriate for it to appear at the end of the documentary. Group 7 is an excellent combat force, and it is the epitome of the heroic Federal Army. They uphold a sense of discipline and honor, but their hearts are filled with precious free will. More importantly, they know why they are fighting. This is the biggest difference between us and the Empire's invaders. This is the most powerful reason why the Federation will definitely obtain the final victory. I, as a veteran who has participated in 2 major wars, would like to announce to all the Federation citizens that your troops are just like Group 7. They are on the path to victory and will definitely bring you more victories. I hope that this vast universe can bear witness to our great history. On the TV screen, this paragraph of words gradually disappeared like sand blown by the wind. It turned into darkness, and in the darkness, there was a dot of white light. It was a star, and then there were more stars. In the end, it turned into a sky full of stars. The magnificent universe appeared in front of everyone's eyes. Outside the TV screen, there was the gentle sound of a violin. In the sound of the violin, a clear and bright female voice gradually became clear and slowly sang. Accompanied by a melancholy but strong and optimistic song, countless pictures appeared on the black TV screen. These pictures were zoomed in and zoomed out to fill the full view. Then, one by one, they faded away and changed to the next one. 5460, the brightly colored planet, a close-up of a military vehicle's tires covered in red soil, Xiong Linquan, who was hugging Darren's autocannon and roaring, and the 6 lines of fire in front of him, Magnolia, who was holding a small knife to cut down a tree, and a few strands of hair in front of his forehead with a calm and focused expression, the rapidly flashing black mass of tombstones in the hills and the white pigeons flying above them. Hundreds of Federation soldiers were silently moving forward in the valley from a bird's-eye view, maintaining a bowed posture. An officer in front was turning his head and shouting, his lips slightly open, but no one knew what he was saying. The battlefield, where the blood had dried up after a fierce battle, and the ashy faces of young soldiers who seemed to be sleeping with their eyes closed. The dense clouds of smoke formed by the dense explosions painted the clear sky with incomprehensible blocks of color. Several young soldiers were laughing and chatting, revealing mouths full of white teeth. In the close-up, there were 2 soldiers standing in the shadow of a tall mecha's alloy legs, lowering their heads and kissing with cigarettes. The last scene was Su Lu sitting on the shoulder of the tall mecha. This time, he was finally not wearing that pair of sunglasses, but he was looking at the rising sun at that time. The red and warm sunlight occupied most of the screen, so the audience could only see his back. The TV screen returned to darkness, and the ethereal and warm female voice slowly ended. A line of small white words appeared at the bottom of the screen. The documentary, Team 7, ended or will continue. Thank you for watching. Su Lu retracted his eyes from the black screen. When he thought of the last scene, he couldn't help but subconsciously touch the sunglasses in the pocket of his military uniform. He forcibly suppressed the urge to put them on, picked up the eye drops and dripped a few drops into his dry eyes. Previously, after completing the mechanical repair work in the Donglin mine, he had developed a good habit of protecting his eyes. Today, after watching 4 episodes of the documentary, he needed to take care of his eyes even more. At this time, he and the soldiers of the new 17th Division were on the Federation's battleship flying towards S1. During the short but somewhat boring journey, because of the interference of the signal from the spatial passage, the quality of the TV on the battleship was very poor, so the battleship began to play the documentary. The documentary, Team 7, had caused a great sensation in the Federation, and it could even be said that it had started a trend. A total of 7 episodes were filmed, and the content of the last few episodes was about the reconstruction of the 17th Division of the Federation's trump card, the sincere cooperation between the Army and Green Dragon Mountain, and the content before that. Su Lu and the soldiers on the front line had been busy fighting, so they didn't have a chance to watch it all. So today, they watched it from the beginning to the end with curiosity, vanity, and some uneasiness. You don't say. This documentary is really good. Lao Bai is really good, especially when it comes to stirring up emotions. Lan Xiaolong, who was trimming his beard, glanced at Bai Yulan and quickly explained, I'm not talking about you. It's not as stirring up emotions as what you said, Bai Yulan said softly, it's very mushy. I really don't want to admit that you're a member of Team 7. Su Le smiled, and in his heart, he admired the documentary's producer, Bai Ziming. As the subject of the documentary, he and his team members were all moved by the documentary, and it was easy for him to imagine what kind of emotions the ordinary audience would have. Rubbing his eyes that had been dripped with eye drops, he suddenly noticed that Da Vinci beside him was a little silent. He asked curiously, "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking, what does the 13th floor's sister look like?" Da Vinci's eyes were fixed on the TV screen. Previously, he was extremely angry because there was too little footage of the 13th floor, but after calming down, he fell into silence again. After being awakened, he quickly replied, "If his sister looks as ugly as him, wouldn't I be at a disadvantage?" Su Le looked at him in a daze and asked doubtfully, "You've really decided to go back and marry his sister? Skyscraper did save you, and you have a good relationship, but marriage is not a good way to repay him. The 13th floor said that his family's main income is the perks he gets when he's a mercenary. If I want to help his family financially, of course, it's easy to do. But I always feel that his family is short of a son. If they have a son like me, the governor's son, as a son-in-law, they shouldn't suffer too much," Da Vinci explained seriously. "The problem is that you haven't even met his sister." Bai Yulan, who rarely expressed her opinion, couldn't help but frown and say, "A marriage without a foundation of feelings will be a mess." "Feelings can be cultivated," Da Vinci said seriously. "I just hope that his sister isn't too ugly, but, as long as she's not too ugly, I'm still willing to marry her." "That's fucking bullshit." Su Le shook his head and said, "Don't think that women will throw themselves at you just because you're the governor's son. Maybe Skyscraper's sister doesn't even like you." "Boss, why do you say, beep beep? We're not the same as we are on TV," Da Vinci asked doubtfully. "We're going back to S1 soon. That's not the lawless front line full of sweat and smoke." Su Le looked at the planet that was gradually becoming clearer outside the window. He shrugged and said helplessly, "I have to get used to how to speak without swearing. Otherwise, what if I suddenly curse his mother when I meet the president?" Although he was joking, in fact, the music at the end of the documentary was still echoing in his heart. The simple violin accompaniment was so melodious, but what really worried him was the quiet female voice mixed in with the violin. The ending song was actually sung by Jian Shuai. Didn't she decide to disappear from public view? He was going back to the familiar S1 and was going to see many close and long-lost people. At this moment, Su Le couldn't help but feel a little nervous. How's Lu Hua's appetite now? Zhou Yu still has that bad temper. How much closer is the distance between Li Qishao and his brother? Shang Qiu's figure, oh, she had just seen it. Her figure was as exaggerated and beautiful as ever. What about the daughter of the Prime Minister's family? He hadn't replied to her all this time. Was she happy? There was another very important thing. Did the anti-selling fast food boxes below the Wangdu apartments have a relationship with the head of the protein meat ration station? The S1 Capital Military Airport was heavily guarded today. The police were scattered everywhere as if they were facing a great enemy. Agents in black uniforms nervously patrolled all suspicious places, but the rest of the people had joyful smiles on their faces. There was not a trace of nervousness at all. This was the scene of the Federation's ceremony to welcome the victorious return of the frontline soldiers. President Pabre, Vice President and Speaker Byron, Vice Speaker Shaun, the special representative of the Green Dragon Mountain Committee, and the top figures of the Federation were all gathered here. They gave the dozens of slowly landing giant warships and the ordinary young Federation soldiers on the warships the highest courtesy. On the three-dimensional screen above the airport, the TV footage of the Iron 7th Division's attack to the north in the Battle of Yellow Mountain Ridge was playing non-stop, as well as the already famous documentary. Chapter 535. The battleship landed in the jubilant spaceport. Amidst the blast of air, the cheerful military music grew louder and shook the clouds. A few minutes later, this group of soldiers who were going to participate in the welcome ceremony walked out from under the huge battleship. Many soldiers looked at the scene in front of them with surprised and nervous expressions. Su Lu was also one of them, but he was not surprised or frightened by the Federation's enthusiasm at this moment. The sunglasses on the bridge of his nose reflected the clear afternoon sun. He dragged the box that Jian Shui'er had specially sent over with his left hand and slowly walked out from the caterpillar tunnel under the belly of the battleship. In the distance, Shi Qinghai was mixed in with the Green Dragon Mountain team. He raised his eyebrows and walked down from the belly of the battleship with a smile on his face. He was also dragging a box beside him. In the box was the ACW that Mr. President had specially approved. Wearing a neat military uniform and a young and determined face, he could really be described as handsome. However, there were countless Federation soldiers arriving at the spaceport today, so the two of them were naturally submerged in the crowd. Most of the soldiers who participated in the battle had already returned to their respective planets. The native soldiers of the West Woods had probably already returned home to enjoy the delicious taste of mashed potatoes and stewed meat slices. Only a small number of soldiers could appear at the Federation's welcome ceremony today. However, a small number here was a relatively new concept. More than 30,000 Federation soldiers gathered together, still a black mass spread over the entire tarmac. It was a very spectacular sight. The stern and austere military orders of the military commanders of the various troops rang out. Tens of thousands of Federation soldiers quickly lined up on the tarmac. In a very short time, they were divided into 3 square formations and lined up neatly in front of the rostrum. The military music gradually stopped. On the rostrum, General Miles gave a speech that was full of enthusiasm but also full of the tone of a military camp. Then, he began to call the names of the soldiers who had participated in the battle to come up to the rostrum. The soldiers who could be praised at the ceremony were naturally people who had made outstanding contributions on the front lines. Su Lu was not surprised to hear his name called. He lowered his head and rubbed his nose that was not used to the dry air of S1. He followed behind a captain that he did not recognize and walked up to the rostrum. There was a sense of discipline in the awards ceremony. Other than making the soldiers on the tarmac feel excited, there was nothing special about it until President Pabre personally hung a Purple Star medal on the left chest of Su Li's military uniform. The Purple Star was the federal military's highest honor. Even Madman Li, who had the most outstanding achievements on the front lines, had not won this medal until today. The people in the federal forces were very clear about the important role that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu played in this victorious military campaign. They were very clear about the excellent performance he had displayed in the battle. However, when they saw the Purple Star medal hanging on his chest, they could not help but feel shocked. During the awards ceremony, President Pabre's tanned face did not have any extra emotions. He calmly looked at Su Lu and arranged his medal ribbon. His thick lips slightly opened and said in a low voice, "Little guy, this time, we have returned what the Federation owed you." Su Lu did not reply. As the person involved, he was very clear that this Purple Star medal, which represented the highest honor, was mainly a reward for assassinating Macklin and thus stopping the Empire's great conspiracy. The award from the President and the Ministry of Defense was just to make up for the past debt. After a moment of silence, he looked at President Pabre, raised his right hand, and performed a standard Federation military salute. He said, "Thank you, Mr. President." Following that, there were still quite a few officers who received awards. Among them, the most eye-catching one was of course that Du Shaoqing, who stood in the wind like a snow plum blossom proudly admiring himself, yet was truly astonishingly brilliant and made people admire him. The awards ceremony continued until the end. Zhong Shouhu, who stood at the front of the square formation, walked up to the rostrum with an expressionless face. He slowly raised his forearm and the tip of his second finger was perfectly aligned with the brim of his hat. As the highest military officer who led the entire Federation's counterattack operation, Commander Zhong naturally had to have a different appearance. President Prabal stared at the Silan warlord whom the federal political circle viewed as an enemy and an irreconcilable enemy. After a moment of silence, he naturally opened his arms and gave the other party a warm and sincere hug, much to the surprise of the tens of thousands of soldiers present. "You've worked hard." President Pabre handed a square agarwood box to Zhong Shouhu and said with a smile, "The Federation has nothing to reward you with. This is just a personal gift from me to express the admiration of the female role in my family for your commanding skills." "Mr. President, you flatter me," Commander Zhong said with a smile. "I just didn't let you down." Hearing this, President Pabre put his hands on his waist and laughed out loud in a manner that was completely uncharacteristic of a politician. The ceremony was still going on. Su Lu, who was enjoying the treatment of a deputy division commander, could only obediently occupy an inconspicuous corner at the back of the countless generals on the rostrum. He watched the big shots of the military in front of him happily conversing. In his heart, he kept thinking about what he should do first when he returned to Wangdu Apartments later. At this moment, he saw that in the front row of the rostrum, Zhong Shouhu was looking straight ahead, but he raised his right hand and hooked his finger behind him, making a gesture to greet him forward. Su Lu was slightly dazed. The war heroes and high-level officers of the Federation next to him, on the other hand, had already cleared the way with envious eyes and knowing smiles. He scratched his head and walked forward along the path that his colleagues had made way for him. He stood behind Commander Zhong and asked in a low voice, "Commander, what orders do you have?" "The upper echelons of the Federation have all arrived. Representatives from all over the capital city have come to welcome you. Everywhere you look, there is jubilation and respect." Zhong Shouhu did not turn around. He asked with a smile, "Does it feel good?" Su Lu lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then replied with a smile, "It does feel good." General Miles, who was standing in the middle of the first row, heard the conversation between him and Zhong Shouhu. He said indifferently, "Kid, this is the treatment we deserve as soldiers, so you have to get used to it." Zhong Shouhu looked straight ahead, shook his head and said, "General, you stole my line. I saw this young man first." General Miles, as the chairman of the Joint Staff Officers, was the real boss of the military. Faced with the question of the local tyrant of the West Woods, he raised his eyebrows and said, "Is that so? The problem is that I got this guy out of Qingqing prison." Su Lu did not know how to respond when he heard the two top military bosses arguing about such a boring topic that was closely related to him. He could only lower his head and look at the dust on his military boots, keeping his mouth shut. At this time, he did not realize what kind of shock this scene of standing behind the two bosses and having a very private conversation would bring to the people present. This shock was not only the confirmation of some rumors, but also some problems in the future. "I declare victory. The military operation has achieved the most complete victory. From this moment on, no invader of the empire can stand on our own land." At this time, President Pabre finally began his speech. The president, who was born as a lawyer, continued his super-speaking ability that he had shown in countless elections. His words were like countless heavy fruits that fell on the fertile land, making the whole spaceport quiet down. The tens of thousands of Federation soldiers were focused, and a strong impulse and sense of honor was born spontaneously, making it hard to forget. At the end of the speech, the president waved his right arm vigorously, his body slightly leaned forward, and with a calm and determined look, he looked down at the participating troops and countless reporters and flashing lights in the spaceport, and said, "The free people will never be satisfied with the temporary victory over the despotic darkness. This year, or next year, I and all of you here will definitely fight to the homeland of the empire. The Federation has never been a collection of belligerent citizens. The purpose of war is peace. It is still the same time, this year or next year, but we will definitely march forward bravely." Mr. Pabre stared at a young soldier in front of the dense square and said solemnly, "But we will not be blinded by victory. I can only promise you that that day will come, but I can't promise when it will come." Perhaps this is a strange remark that no one in the Federation who is used to winning is willing to say. But I have to say it. The president smiled and said, "Please maintain a certain degree of patience." There was still no timetable to enter the homeland of the empire, and the political circle of the Federation was still hesitating. Even in such a grand ceremony, the president admitted it. Hearing those words, many people in the federal military standing on the rostrum lowered their eyes. What those generals and heroes hoped most was that the Federation could fight to the homeland of the empire as soon as possible. On the spacious tarmac of the capital's military airport, it suddenly became quiet. No one applauded. The soldiers looked at the blurry figures on the rostrum with complicated feelings. They even had some bad omens. Could it be that during the glorious welcome ceremony, there would actually be signs of trouble on the stage? At this moment, Zhong Shouhu, the commander of the West Woods military district, who no one expected, began to clap very seriously. General Miles began to clap without changing his expression. Then, Minister of National Defense Zhou Yingxing and Mr. Li Jiedu, the president of the First Military Academy, began to clap one after another. Applause seemed to be something that was naturally contagious. Especially after the four military leaders made clear reactions, the participating troops, the government, and the high officials of the parliament all began to clap hard. In an instant, the thunderous applause soared into the sky. When the ceremony was over and Su Lu was about to leave with his team, a sentence suddenly floated into his ears. "Come to my house for dinner in 2 days." Minister of National Defense Zhou Yingxing stood at the front of the rostrum and didn't turn his head. No one could be sure if it was him who said those words. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.